Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, we will now proceed with the review of Nepal. In accordance with Resolution 5/1, the review is based on the national report, the compilation report as prepared by the OHCHR, and a summary of stakeholders' information also prepared by the OHCHR. I'm very pleased to welcome His Excellency Mr. Kamal Thapa, Deputy Prime Minister and Minister for Foreign Affairs of Nepal, and his delegation. Before I give you the floor, Your Excellency, to introduce the report, I would like to take this opportunity to express my sincere condolences to the people of Nepal, in particular to the families and relatives of those who were victims of the bus accident which occurred yesterday. According to the latest reports, at least 35 individuals died and 30 more were injured. I now have the honor to give the floor to His Excellency Mr. Kamal Thapa to introduce the report of Nepal. You have the floor.
Mr. President, Excellencies and representatives from member states and observers, ladies and gentlemen, first of all, I would like to thank Mr. President for his kind words towards me and his message of condolences to the victim of the bus accident that we had yesterday in Nepal. Mr. President, I would like to begin by extending the warm greetings from the people and the government of Nepal. I feel proud to share with you about the recent promulgation of our new constitution. This marks the conclusion of the peace process initiated in 2006. A new journey towards peace, stability, and prosperity has now begun. It is a great honor and privilege for me to present Nepal's second UPR report to this August session. My delegation is pleased to have this opportunity to present this report on Nepal's efforts towards fulfilling its international obligations and commitments on the issues of human rights, update the status of implementation of the recommendations that we accepted under the first UPR cycle, highlight our achievements, and share what remains to be done, as well as the challenges and constraints we confront with. We look forward to having a productive, interactive dialogue with the member states on these issues. My delegation includes the ambassador and permanent representative of the permanent mission of Nepal to the UN in Geneva, secretaries of relevant ministries, and other senior officials from different agencies responsible for the formulation of human rights policies and implementation of human rights obligations. Mr. President, the new democratic and inclusive constitution was promulgated in Nepal on 20th September 2015 through the Constituent Assembly elected by the people in November 2013. With it, the long-cherished aspiration of the people to have a constitution written by their own representatives has been fulfilled. It has been made possible by the rigorous democratic exercises spanning over 8 years, conducted in an inclusive, transparent, and participatory manner, giving due consideration to Nepal's vast diversity. The promulgation of the new constitution marks the conclusion of the peace process, as well as the historic political transition in Nepal. It has also institutionalized the federal democratic system of governance in the country, paving the way for political stability, sustainable peace, and economic prosperity. It has also significantly ensures inclusive democracy, pluralism, the rule of law, the democratic values of governance, representative and accountable government, social and economic justice, and universally accepted human rights. The new constitution guarantees substantive equality and promotes human dignity, identity, and opportunity for all by ending all forms of discrimination and inequalities. This fundamental law of the land safeguards every right of persons, groups, and communities, embracing multi-ethnic, multilingual, multicultural, and diverse geographical specificity. It further aims to create an egalitarian society on the basis of the principles of proportional inclusion and participation, to ensure equitable economic opportunities, shared prosperity, and social justice by ending discriminations related to class, ethnicity, region, language, religion, and gender. For this, the proportional electoral system, inclusive representation of marginalized and disadvantaged communities in all the state organs, positive discrimination, and special provisions with regard to rights of women, Dalits, Madhesis, indigenous people, Tharus, Muslims, persons with disabilities, and minorities have been guaranteed in the Constitution. The Constitution has ambitiously broadened the scope of fundamental rights by ensuring a wide range of economic, social, and cultural rights, including right to employment, right to food, right to housing, right of social justice, right of consumers, and so on. Similarly, the directive principles of the Constitution provide a framework for progressive realization of socio-economic rights and guidance for the successive governments to shape relevant laws and policies in line with those principles. In a nutshell, the Constitution fully catches the spirit of universally accepted human rights and ensures their promotion and protection. The new Constitution has been significantly progressive in eliminating gender-based discrimination, as well as empowering women through enhanced representation. It has ensured at least one-third representation of women in the federal parliament as well as the state assembly, and at least 40% representation of women at the lowest local level. It has provisions for either speaker or deputy speaker of both houses to be women, and also ensures right to lineage, right against all forms of exploitation, equal rights in the family matters, and property, among others. The Constitution has similar provisions for President and Vice President, ensuring that the two positions are held by persons of different sex or community. I wish to share with this august gathering that both the newly elected Speaker of the Parliament and President of the country are women. The historic elections have well reflected the spirit of the new inclusive Constitution. Similarly, with a view to ensuring further inclusivity and empowerment of every community in society, the Constitution has established and further strengthened various commissions as independent constitutional bodies, such as the National Women Commission, National Dalit Commission, National Inclusion Commission, Indigenous People and Nationalities Commission, Madhesi Commission, Tharu Commission, and Muslim Commission. The government is committed to building on the solid foundation laid by the new Constitution for the continued promotion and protection of human rights with necessary legal, institutional, and administrative mechanisms. The formation and operationalization of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, as well as Commission on Enforced Disappearances, also reflects the government's commitment to addressing the serious violation of human rights committed during the period of conflict, ending impunity, and providing justice to victims, as well as promoting sustainable peace, harmony, and reconciliation in society based on ground reality. The independent and competent judiciary constantly defends and advances human rights agenda in the country, including through judicial pronouncements and verdicts. The vibrant and free media, active civil society, as well as the ever-growing awareness and consciousness of the general people about their rights continue to strengthen the human rights environment in the country. Moreover, the National Human Rights Commission assumes central role in the protection and promotion of human rights with responsibility for independent investigation to all human rights violations as well as for overall monitoring of human rights situation. Mr. President, in the last 4 years, after the first UPR, the country has been able to accomplish many significant progresses in the overall human rights situation in the country. The basic elements of the rule of law and human rights are being incorporated in the periodic development plans. The rights-based approach has become an important consideration in every aspect of national life. By formulating an action plan on implementation of UPR recommendations received in 2011, we have set a stage for more effective outcomes of important human rights issues with significant monitorable progress. The major accomplishments, the conclusion of the peace process, and historic political transition in particular, have been nationally driven. The country's experience in democratic exercise and collaboration on the overall interest of the country during the peace process and political transition has been quite important and unique. While the prolonged political transition posed at times serious threats to the democratic norms and values, rule of law, and enhanced the possibility of impunity, particularly with the broad distinction between criminal acts and political activities. It has also been an enlightening experience to guide further course of action. It is during this process that we realized the importance of compromise and flexibility to move forward from a context like ours, characterized by diversity and divergent views. The endogenous homegrown process that we pursued has proved to be an effective vehicle to arrive at a broader consensus on all critical issues, including the political system and governance. We are confident of our ability to resolve any conflicting issue with our own efforts and through peaceful means. Any disruption of this process, as well as internal dynamics, through any exogenous interest, will only complicate matters. It is with this conviction that the new government is engaged in dialogue with the Madhya-based political parties to win their confidence and resolve the differences within the constitutional framework. While the government is quite serious and sensitive to their concerns, the nature and effects of the continued agitation have been detrimental to our national interest and the overall well-being of the people. In fact, we are currently at a very delicate situation resulting from the obstruction of essential supplies at the border points. Lives and livelihood of the entire population have been adversely affected. Schools and hospitals also bear the brunt of current circumstances, exposing millions of children, elderly and sick persons to greater risk and vulnerabilities. The future of our children is at stake. Our regional and international trade have been constrained. Our industries are on the verge of collapse. The tourism sector has been hit hard. Our economy has suffered a huge setback. If the current trend is not checked, the country is likely to experience an unjust and severe humanitarian crisis. This needs to be avoided. While we seek to address political problems through dialogue, the continuous obstruction at border points, under any pretext, has severely impeded the exercise of rights and freedom that Nepal is entitled under the international law as a landlocked country. As a least developed country that has emerged from a decade-long armed conflict, followed by a protracted political transition, and is just taking steps forward on a path of recovery and reconstruction with the support of the international community in the aftermath of the devastating earthquakes. The challenges and pressures besetting the nation and the people at present are immensely painful. Nevertheless, We are quite optimistic in view of our ability and competence to resolve our differences on our own for the national interest of the country. The present government has already begun the process of dialogue and is confident of arriving at a mutually acceptable solution soon. Like many other democratic constitutions, the Constitution of Nepal is also a living and dynamic document that can be amended in accordance with the needs and aspirations of the people. It is flexible enough to adequately address the new context the nation faces through timely amendment. We, the people of Nepal, are increasingly getting used to the significance and necessity of the democratic norms, rules, and processes to resolve differences without undermining social harmony, cohesion that have been the defining features of our diverse society. Mr. President, the fundamental goal of the new government, elected a few weeks back, is to effectively implement the new constitution by removing the structural and functional obstacles, challenges in the way of socio-economic transformation of the country. The government has started to take necessary measures to formulate necessary legislative and policy tools needed for the smooth operationalization of the Constitution. As the country ushers in a new era, we are also keen to give further momentum to our economic development agenda. Despite the huge devastation and setback caused by the recent earthquakes, Nepal will continue to pursue the goal of graduation from the LDC status by 2022 and becoming a middle-income country by 2030. I would like to express the government's commitment to keep up the spirit generated by the new constitution in advancing the cause of human rights. Mr. President, despite the consistent efforts in the promotion and protection of human rights, Nepal continues to confront challenges in meeting some of the desired targets and fulfilling obligations. Paucity of resources, landlocked situation, low level of economic development, rampant poverty, deprivation of basic needs and amenities, low level of education, among others, have adversely affected the implementation of action plans on human rights. Moreover, the prolonged political transition had also left negative impacts on creating conducive environment required for the promotion of human rights in the country. As the political transition has come to an end with the promulgation of the new constitution, the country is in a position to undertake further steps forward for the effective realization of all human rights by all with adequate support from the international community. We stress the importance of strict adherence to the principles of universality, objectivity, and non-selectivity by all human rights mechanisms. Under the United Nations, as democracy, development, peace, security, and human rights are interdependent, they call for a holistic approach to address the human rights issues. The efforts of the international community must therefore be geared towards creating an environment for the enjoyment of all human rights, including civil and political rights, social, cultural and economic rights, and the right to development. For a country like Nepal, the enjoyment of the right to development will have significant impact on the promotion of other rights. It is in this context that we attach huge importance to the effective and balanced implementation of the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development adopted by the world leaders in September this year. The transformative ambition of the 2030 Agenda, along with its focus, among others, on peace, equality and freedom, offers a new hope and opportunity for the enjoyment of human rights by all. Mr. President, to conclude, I would like to reiterate our total and unflinching commitment to the promotion and protection of human rights. There is a greater awareness and positive outlook in the country among both the state and non-state actors about the value of human rights. As I also consider the UPR as an opportunity to learn from others. I look forward to receiving your valuable inputs during your constructive engagement in the interactive dialogue. I am confident that with the greater understanding and support of the international community, Nepal will continue to make significant progress in the days ahead. I thank you for your kind attention.
Thank you, Your Excellency. This brings us now to the speakers list. I would like to remind you that the speaking time will now be 1 minute and 35 seconds for all, and I would like to invite speakers to respect the established time limit in order to accommodate all the inscribed speakers. The first speaker is now the distinguished representative from the Maldives.
Thank you, Mr. President. The Maldives would like to welcome the distinguished delegation of Nepal, led by Deputy Prime Minister and Minister of Foreign Affairs of Nepal, His Excellency Mr. Kamal Thapa, and express its appreciation for its national report and their engagement in the second cycle of UPR. The Maldives would like to make the following recommendations. 1. Take measures to ensure compulsory and free primary and quality education for all. 2. Take measures to ensure universal vaccination coverage. While Maldives recalls the recent earthquake that struck Nepal in April 2015, which caused widespread destruction and loss of life, the Maldives appreciates the government's reconstruction efforts in restoring the critical public services, such as establishing temporary local government offices and other public buildings, as well as its continued focus on the long-term programs in livelihoods and community infrastructures. Maldives welcomes the adoption of the 7th iteration of the Nepal Constitution as a major milestone in the country's democratic development. Moreover, as long-term proponents of the importance of healthcare, the Maldives was pleased to see Nepal has approved a new National Health Policy 2014 and National Insurance Directives 2014 to ensure the right to health as a fundamental right of every citizen. Maldives appreciates the implementation of National Strategy and Action Plan on Gender Empowerment and Elimination of Gender-Based Violence as an umbrella policy and other sectoral policies on women's rights. Maldives wishes Nepal success during this review. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you. The next speaker is the distinguished delegate from Mauritius.
Mr. President, my delegation thanks Honorable Kamal Thapa, Deputy Prime Minister and Minister of Foreign Affairs, for the comprehensive presentation of the National Report of Nepal. Mauritius recognizes the challenges of Nepal following the disastrous earthquake that shattered the country in April last. We commend Nepal for implementing most of the recommendations received during its first review through an action plan, and encouraged it to put in place the necessary mechanism to reach its objectives. We also take good note of the progress made in the areas of poverty eradication, human rights education, food safety, and health. We encourage Nepal to pursue further its initiative in favor of advancement of women and gender empowerment. In this regard, we note the low rate of women's employment in the public service sector and in other decision-making process that prevents Nepalese women to participate fully in the economic development of the country. We therefore recommend Nepal to redouble efforts towards providing more opportunities for women's active involvement in the economic and political spheres. I thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you. Next speaker is the distinguished delegate from Mexico.
Muchas gracias, señor presidente. Buenas tardes. Damos una cordial bienvenida a la delegación de Nepal y agradecemos la presentación de su informe, en especial la intervención del señor viceprimer ministro y canciller. Muchas gracias. México reconoce la actitud constructiva de Nepal al identificar en el informe nacional los retos pendientes en la promoción y protección de los derechos humanos, por lo que alentamos a Nepal a continuar con los esfuerzos emprendidos para enfrentar dichos retos. Extendemos nuestra felicitación por la promulgación de la nueva Constitución y por los avances descritos en su informe. Valoramos positivamente los avances normativos, entre ellos la puesta en marcha de la Estrategia Nacional y Plan de Acción sobre el empoderamiento de género
Mike.
Ahí estoy de nuevo. Valoramos positivamente los avances normativos, entre ellos la puesta en marcha de la Estrategia Nacional y Plan de Acción sobre el Empoderamiento de Género y la eliminación de la violencia de género. Para México se permite hacer unas recomendaciones respetuosas y constructivas. Número 1, fortalecer el marco legislativo institucional para promover y proteger los derechos de los pueblos indígenas, particularmente asegurar su plena participación en la sociedad. Y número 2, continuar los esfuerzos para prevenir y sancionar la discriminación y la violencia contra las mujeres y asegurar mecanismos adecuados para proporcionar asistencia y protección a las mujeres víctimas de delitos. Muchas gracias, señor presidente.
Thank you. Next speaker is distinguished delegate from Montenegro.
Thank you, Mr. President. Montenegro welcomes the distinguished delegation of Nepal and thanks Deputy Prime Minister and Minister of Foreign Affairs, Mr. Tapa, for his introductory statement. Montenegro welcomes commitment of the government of Nepal to promote and integrate human rights perspective into all national policies and development programs, especially after the recent devastating earthquake. We commend the efforts made by the authorities to strengthen the national framework for human rights and encourage them to fully implement all accepted international human rights forms. We also welcome the steps taken by the government to implement the policy of zero tolerance against torture, including training programs on human rights and internal policy control procedures with regard to the use of torture, as well as activities aimed to ensure humane treatment for detainees. However, we noted that the Committee Against Torture stated that torture remained widespread, while the Special Rapporteur on Torture expressed deep concern about the prevailing culture of impunity for torture. Montenegro would like to ask government to elaborate furthermore on its comprehensive plan of action, if any, to address a number of recommendations with regard to effective investigation of torture or ill treatment and prosecution of alleged perpetrators. Finally, Montenegro makes the following recommendations. First, to ratify the third optional protocol to the CRC on communication procedures, and second, to ratify the optional protocol to the Convention Against Torture. I thank you.
Thank you. The next speaker is distinguished delegate from Morocco.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Permettez-moi tout d'abord de remercier Monsieur le Vice-Premier ministre et ministre des Affaires étrangères du Népal, délégation de la République du Népal pour la présentation du rapport national de son pays. Le Maroc salue les avancées notables enregistrées par la République du Népal en matière de la justice transitionnelle et des droits de l'homme, particulièrement illustrées par la création d'une commission de la vérité et de réconciliation avec la commission d'enquête sur les personnes disparues. Le Royaume du Maroc apprécie par ailleurs l'importance que le gouvernement du Népal accorde aux droits de travail et à la lutte contre la pauvreté, une importance manifeste dans la mise en place des mesures visant à améliorer le progrès des travailleurs népalais. Ma délégation se félicite de l'élévation au rang d'organe constitutionnel de la Commission nationale des droits de l'homme par la Constitution provisoire de 2007 et la loi de 2012, et salue par ailleurs le projet de loi à l'étude par le ministère de l'Éducation qui a pour but la mise en place d'une éducation de base obligatoire et gratuite. Conscient des efforts consentis par l'ampleur de la difficulté de la tâche qui reste à accomplir, le Maroc souhaiterait faire les deux recommandations suivantes. Poursuivre les efforts en vue de faciliter l'accès au logement pour les groupes marginalisés à faible revenu et persévérer dans ces efforts de lutte contre la pauvreté et faciliter l'accès à l'eau pour les populations rurales. Enfin, ma délégation est confiante dans la détermination de la République du Népal à relever les défis qui lui restent en matière des droits de l'homme et des droits humains. Je vous remercie, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you. Next speaker is distinguished delegate from Myanmar.
Mr. President, my delegation warmly welcomes the delegation of Nepal, led by His Excellency Mr. Kamal Tapa, Deputy Prime Minister and Minister for Foreign Affairs. We appreciate Nepal's comprehensive report and updated information on its endeavor to promote and protect of human rights. In the UBR report of Nepal, we are delighted to note that the government commitment to the implementation of periodic National Human Rights Action Plan in collaboration with the National Human Rights Institution and civil society organizations. My delegation would like to make the following recommendations: to continue effort to improve national mechanism for the promotion and protection of human rights, to further strengthen the capacity in implementing the environmental strategy and plan to combat natural disaster. And thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you. The next speaker is distinguished delegate from Namibia.
Namibia welcomes the delegation of Nepal to the 23rd session of the UPR and commends them on the presentation of the national report for this review. The world was shocked to hear of the tragic loss of life, suffering and damage caused by the earthquake that had struck Nepal in April 2015. We again extend our heartfelt condolences to the government and people of Nepal. We are cognizant of the difficult and taxing demands which are facing the government of Nepal in its efforts to come to terms with the consequences of this event in addition to existing challenges. We encourage the government of Nepal to remain steadfast in their efforts to promote and protect the human rights of its people, as this will instill confidence and stability with them. We are pleased to note the progress made with this new constitution-making process and wish Nepal all success with its outcome. We also commend Nepal on the newly introduced National Shelter Housing Plan of 2014, which aims to ensure favorable, secure and environmental-friendly shelter for all income groups. Namibia would like to make the following recommendations. 1. That Nepal partners with states and organizations who have experience working with children affected by armed conflict to develop programs designed to their need to rehabilitation and integration. 2. That Nepal takes all necessary measures to ensure effective implementation of the Caste-Based Discrimination and Untouchability Act of 2011 and to eliminate all forms of discrimination against women. 3. That Nepal ensures equal access to education for all children. I thank you.
We have to move on. The next speaker is the distinguished delegate from Denmark.
Mr. President, Denmark welcomes the presentation by the Nepalese delegation. Denmark welcomes the Caste-Based Discrimination and Untouchability Act from 2011. However, discrimination based on gender, caste, ethnicity and religion is still widespread despite some progress made with the new constitution. Denmark recommends that Nepal ensures full and effective implementation of the 2011 Caste-Based Discrimination and Untouchability Act. The Constitution of 2015 states that torture is a punishable act, but authorities have failed to provide information on investigations, prosecutions, convictions and sanctions imposed on perpetrators. Nepal is a party to the Convention Against Torture and Other Cruel, Inhumane and Degrading Treatment, but has still not ratified the optional protocol. Denmark therefore recommends that Nepal ratifies the optional protocol to the Convention Against Torture and Other Cruel, Inhumane or Degrading Treatment or Punishment. Nepal has carried out positive improvements regarding the Truth and Reconciliation Commission and Disappearance Act. However, the implementation process remains slow. Denmark therefore recommends that Nepal amends the 2014 Commission on Investigation of Disappeared Persons, Truth and Reconciliation Act in compliance with the Supreme Court ruling of 26 February 2015 in order to uphold international standards relating to accountability for gross violations of international human rights and international humanitarian law. I thank you.
Thank you. The next speaker is the distinguished delegate from New Zealand.
Thank you, Mr. President. There have been some encouraging developments in Nepal, including the adoption of a new constitution, which may be a step towards safeguarding the economic, social and cultural rights of all Nepali people. However, New Zealand remains concerned about aspects of women's rights in Nepal. New Zealand recommends Nepal continue to implement measures to ensure all women and girls have equal access to quality sexual and reproductive health care. New Zealand also recommends that Nepal implement measures to ensure that the rights to acquire, transfer and retain citizenship are extended equally to all women and their children. With respect to continued reports of torture, arbitrary detention, extrajudicial and summary executions, New Zealand recommends that all such allegations be promptly investigated and prosecuted and the perpetrators punished. New Zealand also recommends Nepal accede to the optional protocol to the Convention Against Torture. New Zealand furthermore recommends Nepal investigate and prosecute those who committed human rights violations on both sides of the country's civil war and provide reparations to victims in line with international standards under the newly formed Truth and Reconciliation Commission. Finally, Mr. President, New Zealand commends Nepal on the establishment of constitutional committees to increase protection for human rights as outlined by the Deputy Prime Minister and Foreign Minister this afternoon. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you. The next speaker is the distinguished delegate from Nicaragua.
Gracias, señor presidente. Nicaragua da la bienvenida a la delegación de Nepal y le agradece por la presentación de su segundo informe de derechos humanos en el marco del EPU. En este segundo ciclo quisiéramos reconocer los avances del gobierno de Nepal en su proceso de reconciliación nacional emprendido en el 2006 mediante el Acuerdo General de Paz. Asimismo, valoramos el diálogo nacional llevado a cabo para la adopción de una nueva constitución política, la cual busca garantizar todos los derechos y libertades fundamentales en consonancia con las normas internacionales. En este sentido, recomendamos a Nepal que, con base a su nueva constitución, procure la igualdad entre hombres y mujeres, así como el derecho de todos a la no discriminación. Deseamos también reconocer importantes logros alcanzados en materia económica y social, tales como sus mejoras en el sector del empleo y de la seguridad social, que contribuyen indudablemente al alivio de la pobreza. Lamentamos, sin embargo, que dichos logros se hayan visto mermados como consecuencia del reciente y devastador terremoto ocurrido en el país. Nicaragua desea en este segundo examen alentar al gobierno de Nepal continuar promoviendo la unidad nacional y participación ciudadana como bases para su desarrollo. Muchas gracias.
Thank you. Next speaker is distinguished delegate from Norway.
Thank you, Mr. President. Norway welcomes the delegation from Nepal. Nepal has made significant progress in promoting the right to education, most notably through increased school enrollment and gender parity. The enrollment of children with disability remains low and dropout rates are high. Norway recommends Nepal to amend the current education policies to ensure an inclusive education system and implement concrete measures to increase the participation of children with disability. The establishment of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission and the Commission of Inquiry of Enforced Disappeared Persons are important milestones in Nepal's effort to ensure transitional justice. Norway recommends that torture and enforced disappearances shall be explicitly prohibited as criminal offences under Nepali law. Acts of discrimination, trafficking, sexual harassment and assault of women appear to have increased in areas struck by the tragic earthquakes earlier this year. Norway recommends to Nepal to increase efforts to protect women from violence and discrimination, in particular in areas affected by the earthquakes. Norway also recommends Nepal to enact consolidated laws addressing all types of sexual violence effectively, with provision of no statutory limit on rape and other sexual violence, adequate witness and victim protection mechanisms, compensation from state and measures to address special needs of girls below 16. Furthermore, Norway recommends Nepal to amend the Domestic Violence Act, in particular to clarify the definition of sexual harm and broaden the definition of domestic violence to also include threats of violence as well as include all types of physical harm. Thank you, Mr. President.
Our time is up. The next speaker is distinguished delegate from Pakistan.
Thank you, Mr. President. My delegation would like to thank His Excellency Kamal Thapa for presentation of Nepal's National Report on UPR. My delegation takes note with appreciation of the progress made by Nepal in follow-up to the first cycle of UPR that includes establishment of transitional justice mechanisms, significant improvement in security system and the improvement in the functioning of criminal justice system. My delegation congratulates Government of Nepal on the promulgation of Constitution. The realization of creating unity within a diverse population, ensuring equitable representation is commendable. Further integration of women and their increased participation in legislative mechanism is a welcome development. We appreciate the measures taken by Government of Nepal to ensure the right to education, health, housing and acquiring of land for its citizens and introducing the programs for poverty alleviation. It is encouraging that Government of Nepal, through legislation, is ensuring the rights of the indigenous people, minorities and vulnerable groups, and harmonizing the society by linguistic and cultural preservation and enacting laws against racial discrimination. My delegation would like to recommend Nepal may continue to ensure the implementation of ratified human rights treaties and to continue to implement policies for women development under SDGs. My delegation once again thank the delegation of Nepal for comprehensive presentation and wish them all the best. Thank you.
Thank you. I'd like to call upon the distinguished delegate from Panama to take the floor.
Gracias, señor presidente. Panamá da la más cordial bienvenida a la distinguida delegación de Nepal y lo felicita por la presentación de su segundo informe nacional en materia de derechos humanos bajo el mecanismo del examen periódico universal. Acogemos con satisfacción que el reporte haya sido resultado de un amplio proceso de consulta con las instituciones nacionales de derechos humanos, las organizaciones de la sociedad civil y los medios de comunicación, así como la conformación de un comité de trabajo interinstitucional para elaborar el informe. Resaltamos la adopción e implementación de múltiples políticas y programas para promover la igualdad de género, lo que ayudará a reducir las manifestaciones patriarcales y los estereotipos arraigados a la discriminación contra la mujer. También elogiamos a Nepal por haber acogido con generosidad un gran número de refugiados y solicitantes de asilo. Señor Presidente, Panamá gentilmente tiene a bien hacer las siguientes recomendaciones a Nepal. Diseñar instrumentos de medición que permitan generar datos fiables y desglosados sobre personas con discapacidad y que puedan eliminar cualquier barrera jurídicas o prácticas discriminatorias hacia estas personas. Segundo, analizar la posibilidad de aceptar la competencia del Comité contra la Tortura y la ratificación del protocolo opcional. Finalmente, la Delegación de Panamá le desea éxitos en la ejecución de las recomendaciones aceptadas durante el segundo EPU. Muchas gracias, señor Presidente.
Thank you. Next speaker is distinguished delegate from Paraguay.
Gracias, presidente. Paraguay saluda a la distinguida delegación de Nepal y agradece la presentación de su informe. Celebramos la adopción de un sistema de justicia transicional que incluye comisiones de verdad y reconciliación y de investigación de desapariciones forzadas. Animamos a Nepal a que continúe con los esfuerzos para que éstas sean efectivas en su actuación. Tomamos nota con satisfacción de la redacción de la nueva Constitución. Confiamos en que ésta se encuentre acorde a los estándares internacionales de acuerdo a las obligaciones y compromisos contraídos por Nepal. Asimismo, apreciamos los avances realizados en la ampliación de la participación política de las mujeres en el Parlamento. Reconocemos las dificultades particulares en la protección de los derechos humanos en casos de desastres naturales, como los sufridos por el país este año. Nos permitimos solicitar mayor información sobre la forma en que la ayuda humanitaria ha sido distribuida. Particularmente, agradeceríamos saber si el Estado ha garantizado una distribución equitativa entre las víctimas. También expresamos nuestra preocupación por la situación de violencia contra las mujeres en Nepal, así como las altas tasas de tráfico de personas, en especial niñas y mujeres dalí. El Paraguay recomienda ratificar e implementar la Convención para la Protección de todas las personas contra las desapariciones forzadas y el Estatuto de Roma, desarrollar políticas públicas para la implementación efectiva de la Ley sobre Discriminación por Casta e Intocabilidad, implementar programas de educación en derechos humanos para la fuerza pública y analizar la posibilidad de crear un sistema nacional de seguimiento de recomendaciones internacionales. Muchas gracias.
Thank you. Next speaker is distinguished delegate from the Philippines.
Thank you, Mr. President. The Philippines warmly welcomes the distinguished delegation of Nepal to the 23rd UPR session and thanks the delegation for the presentation of its national report. The Philippines acknowledges the adoption of the new constitution of Nepal, particularly the inclusion of guarantees for fundamental rights and freedoms in line with international standards. It is noteworthy that the new Nepalese constitution also established the democratic political system and is a product of its first democratically elected representatives. The delegation lauds Nepal for its adherence to human rights-based approach in public policies and development programs, as seen in its national human rights action plans. The Philippines recognizes that Nepal, as a country coming out from conflict and natural disasters, is in need of enhanced international support for economic development and for reconstruction of infrastructure damaged and destroyed by earthquakes. The delegation recommends that Nepal consider the following. 1. Continue to engage its partners with a view to build capacity and mobilize resources in support of its development efforts and in fulfilling its human rights obligations. 2. Consider ratifying the ICRMW and ILO Convention 189. And 3. Ensure that its climate action is informed by its human rights commitments and obligations. We wish Nepal a successful review. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you. Next speaker is the distinguished delegate from Portugal.
Thank you, Mr. President. Portugal welcomes the delegation of Nepal and thanks for the presentation of its national EPR report. Portugal welcomes the fact that Nepal's National Human Rights Institution has kept its A status according to the Paris Principles. However, Portugal recommends that Nepal amends its National Human Rights Commission Act in order to guarantee the independence and financial autonomy of this commission. Portugal notes with appreciation the entry into force of the National Human Rights Action Plan, as well as of several policies and programs to promote gender equality. Portugal would like to recommend that Nepal strengthens its national commissions, namely the National Women Commission, in order to implement the adopted policies. Portugal recommends that Nepal considers establishing a permanent interministerial committee responsible for the implementation of its international human rights obligations, inter alia for coordinating the drafting of the national reports to treaty bodies. We further recommend that Nepal submits its overdue reports on CERD and CEDAW. Portugal would like to recommend that Nepal signs and ratifies the optional protocol to CAT, as well as the optional protocol to the ICERSC. Finally, Portugal would also like to recommend that Nepal ratifies the Conventions on Refugees and Stateless Persons and the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court. I thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you. I'd like to call upon the distinguished delegate from Qatar to take the floor.
السيد الرئيس، يرحب وفد بلادي برئيس وفد جمهورية نيبال الديمقراطية الاتحادية ويشكره على المعلومات القيمة التي تم تقديمها حول تطورات في مجال حقوق الإنسان. كما نشيد بالمشاورات التي تم عقدها بمشاركة واسعة لإعداد التقرير الوطني الثاني. السيد الرئيس، على الرغم من التحديات التي تواجه النيبال بما في ذلك العمل على التعافي من آثار الزلزال المدمر الذي وقع هذا العام، إلا أن النيبال تبذل جهودا كبيرة تنفيذ خطة عملها الوطنية الخماسية لحقوق الإنسان للفترة 2014-2019 وفاء لالتزاماتها بما في ذلك المترتبة على تنفيذ التوصيات الصادرة عن الجولة الأولى من الاستعراض، حيث كلل ذلك بإعداد المشروع الأولي للدستور الجديد للنيبال. وفي هذا الصدد نثمن ما تم تنفيذه من خطة العمل الوطنية للإعاقة لعام 2006 وإنشاء آلية رفيعة المستوى من أجل الارتقاء بحقوق الأشخاص ذوي الإعاقة وتعزيزها. ونوصي بالتالي تعبئة المجتمع الدولي لتقديم المساعدات الفعالة وفق الأولويات الوطنية. ثانيا، النظر في وضع مشروع قانون يجعل التعليم الأساسي إلزاميا ومجانيا. وفي الختام يتمنى وفد بلادي إلى جمهورية نيبال المزيد من التقدم والازدهار. شكرا سيد الرئيس.
Thank you. Next speaker is the distinguished delegate from the Republic of Korea. Microphone, please. You can start again.
Thank you, Mr. President. The Republic of Korea would like to extend a warm welcome to the delegation of the government of Nepal. My delegation acknowledges that the government of Nepal has made significant advancements in the promotion and protection of human rights in the face of the hardship caused by natural disasters. In particular, we highly recommend the establishment of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission and the Commission on Investigation of Enforced Disappeared Persons, as well as the enactment of the new constitution, which upgraded the National Human Rights Commission to the level of a constitutional institution. Bearing this progress in mind, my delegation would like to make the following 3 recommendations. First, we recommend that the government of Nepal consider extending a standing invitation to the mandate holders of all special procedures of the Human Rights Council. Second, we recommend that the government of Nepal ensure the effective functioning of the National Human Rights Commission in accordance with the Bari principles, in particular by providing the Commission with required and adequate levels of funding as well as sufficient autonomy. Third, we recommend that the government of Nepal bring rape laws in line with international standards and remove the 35-day limitation on lodging a complaint of rape with the police. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you. Next speaker is the distinguished delegate from the Russian Federation.
Благодарю вас, господин председатель. Мы приветствуем делегацию Непала и благодарим за представленный национальный доклад. Мы считаем важным достижением вступления в силу новой Конституции, ознаменовавшей успешное завершение основного этапа урегулирования последствий десятилетнего внутреннего конфликта. Принятие основного закона является ключевым условием стабильности и упрочнения единства Непала как суверенного демократического государства. Положительные оценки заслуживают усилия правительства Непала по искоренению расовой дискриминации в стране, в частности, разработка всестороннего плана действий по политике нулевой терпимости в отношении дискриминации по кастовому признаку. Рекомендуем уделить особое внимание реализации плана, направленного на искоренение наихудших форм детского труда к 2016 году и любых форм детского труда к 2020 году, включая недопущение детского труда в неформальном секторе. Благодарю вас.
Thank you. Next speaker is the distinguished delegate from Sierra Leone.
Mr. President, Sierra Leone welcomes the delegation of Nepal and thanks them for their second cycle national report. Sierra Leone was deeply saddened by the loss of life and displacement of hundreds of thousands of people earlier this year following a series of destructive earthquakes in Nepal. We applaud the government on their handling of this catastrophe as well as for their willingness to collaborate effectively with the international community. My delegation notes with interest Nepal's National Human Rights Commission enjoys an A status. We also commend the government on establishing transitional justice mechanisms to address past human rights violations. Concurrently, the plans to implement free and compulsory primary education are noteworthy. However, trafficking in children and their sexual exploitation remain issues of concern, and Sierra Leone would therefore urge Nepal to fully implement strategies to eliminate such practices and promote the social reintegration of victims back into their local communities. Recommendations: 1. Ratify the ICPPED and ICRMW. 2. Ensure that provisions in the revised constitution guarantees the equal rights of women as well as their right to acquire, retain, and transfer citizenship. 3. Adopt a bill criminalizing harmful cultural practices and abolish child, early, and forced marriage. 4. Investigate allegations of extrajudicial killings and deaths in custody as well as of trafficking in human organs. Sierra Leone wishes Nepal every success. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you. The next speaker is distinguished delegate from Singapore.
Thank you, Mr. President. Singapore welcomes the delegation from Nepal to the 23rd UPR Working Group and thanks it for its presentation. Nepal has demonstrated resilience and fortitude in confronting recent challenges, such as the devastating earthquake earlier this year. We welcome Nepal's continued commitment to protect and uphold human rights. We acknowledge the progress that Nepal has made in the area of education. The statistics in the past few years show increases in basic education, and qualified and trained teachers in basic education and literacy rates are encouraging. Singapore recommends that Nepal continues to pursue policies that will increase enrollment in schools of school-going age children, in particular girls and children from indigenous communities and minorities. We commend the efforts by Nepal to promote and protect the right to health of every citizen. Nepal has put in place a new National Health Policy 2014 and increased healthcare human resources and the number of beds in recent years. Singapore recommends that Nepal continues to implement policy measures to ensure that quality healthcare is accessible to all, particularly women and children. As a friend of Nepal, we wish Nepal every success in promoting and protecting the rights of its people. Thank you.
Thank you. I'd like to call upon the distinguished delegate from Slovakia to take the floor.
Thank you, Mr. President. Slovakia thanks the delegation of Nepal for the presentation of the national report. We acknowledge efforts to strengthen human rights protection and hope that the new constitution includes human rights provisions fully in line with international standards. The April's damaging earthquakes had negative impact on the enjoyment of economic and social rights, in particular on the most vulnerable groups. Reports on increasing violence against women on the aftermath of the April earthquake raise concern. We invite the government to adopt measures aimed at enhancing protection of women, including by strengthening the existing legislation. Slovakia shares concerns by the Human Rights Committee regarding harassment and reprisals against journalists and human rights defenders committed by police and security forces and invites the government to properly investigate such acts. Child protection system, in particular access to education, protection from violence, and the children's right to be heard, are areas where further progress is required. Slovakia would like to make the following recommendations to the government of Nepal. 1. Intensify efforts to adopt a revised Children's Act that complies with international standards, including provisions on prohibition of all forms of violence against children, and to ensure sufficient budgetary resources to its implementation. 2. Amend the existing Child Labour Act to include child labour in the informal sector within the purview of the law. And 3. Ratify the optional protocol to the Convention on the Rights of the Child on a Communications Procedure. Thank you.
Thank you. Next speaker is distinguished delegate from Slovenia.
Thank you, Mr. President. Slovenia thanks the distinguished delegation of Nepal for their presentation today. Slovenia welcomes the adoption of the new constitution, which represents a milestone in the process of state restructuring towards a more inclusive and democratic Nepal. The constitution establishes an important framework for addressing the gaps in the promotion and protection of human rights, including gender equality and women's rights, the rights of minorities, and the rights of migrant workers. While welcoming the National Master Plan on the elimination of child labour, we continue to be concerned that the high number of children under the minimum age is working. We also note with concern the prevalence of gender-based violence, including domestic and sexual violence. We would like to recommend to Nepal the following. First, to enforce legislation prohibiting child labor, facilitate access to education for poor and disadvantaged children, and reinforce labor inspections. Second, to effectively enforce its legislation on domestic violence and expedite the adoption of the Bill on Gender Equality and Violence Against Women. Third, to facilitate complaints from victims of gender-based violence and their access to justice, prosecute and punish the perpetrators and protect the victims. And fourth, to increase the awareness-raising campaigns on women's rights and the negative effects of gender-based violence. Thank you.
Thank you. The next speaker is the distinguished delegate from South Africa.
Mr. President, South Africa welcomes the distinguished delegation of Nepal to the 23rd session of the UPR Working Group and thanks the delegation for the comprehensive presentation of its national report. We recognize that Nepal made strides in its new constitution-making process, with a preliminary draft having been endorsed in principle by the Constituent Assembly recently. We trust that the new constitution will ensure all fundamental rights and freedoms, including freedom of religion and the right to equality of all people in line with international standards and the application of the principle of non-discrimination. In view of progress already registered, South Africa would like to recommend the following. 1. Ensure implementation of legislation on the minimum wage in all sectors. 2. Ensure equal opportunities for women in the labor market. And 3. Ensure equal remuneration for men and women workers for the same work or similar work and for the prevention of discrimination on grounds of sex. Finally, Mr. President, my delegation wishes Nepal success in their second review. I thank you.
Thank you. The next speaker is the distinguished delegate from Spain.
Muchas gracias, señor presidente. España da una cordial bienvenida a la delegación de Nepal, agradece su participación y la presentación realizada hoy por el señor viceprimer ministro. España quiere destacar que Nepal haya promulgado una nueva constitución que, entre otros aspectos relacionados con los derechos humanos, define el Estado como multiconfesional. Sin dejar de reconocer este logro, España recomienda que se elimine la prohibición de convertirse, ya que se conculca de esta manera el derecho a la libertad religiosa. Igualmente queremos subrayar el hecho de que el nuevo texto constitucional se refiera específicamente a los derechos de las personas del colectivo LGBT. Se trata de un hito histórico ejemplarizante para el resto de países del continente asiático. España desea recomendar en este sentido que se prevean mecanismos específicos para investigar y castigar posibles casos de discriminación contra las personas LGBTI, sobre todo en sus relaciones con la Administración. En cuanto a la persistencia en Nepal de la violencia de género contra las mujeres y niñas, España recomienda garantizar los medios personales y materiales necesarios para la protección de las víctimas, especialmente en situaciones de emergencia y en lo que se refiere a la efectividad de las órdenes de protección. Asimismo, recomendamos modificar la ley sobre violencia doméstica para que recoja todo tipo de ataques sexuales, tanto entre cónyuges como fuera de matrimonio, además de las amenazas. En materia de apatridia e igualdad de género, España recomienda modificar la legislación sobre nacionalidad para que se pueda acceder a la nacionalidad nepalí a través de cualquiera de los dos progenitores. Finalmente, respecto a las personas con discapacidad, España aprecia los esfuerzos de Nepal para incluir a estas en el sistema educativo. Para asegurar el éxito de este compromiso, España recomienda integrar a activistas en derechos de las personas con discapacidad en el proceso de toma de decisiones sobre políticas educativas. Muchas gracias.
Thank you. Next speaker is the distinguished delegate from Sri Lanka.
Thank you, Mr. President. At the outset, my delegation welcomes the high-level delegation of Nepal and expresses appreciation for the comprehensive national report and the update. Nepal has undergone many challenges in the recent past, including an armed conflict and a devastating earthquake early this year. In this backdrop, we acknowledge the commitment and the efforts of the government of Nepal to promote and protect human rights in the country. As a fellow South Asian country, we congratulate Nepal and her people on the promulgation of a new constitution last month and on the election of the first woman president of the country. Sri Lanka welcomes the policy initiatives made by Nepal towards the realization of the right to education. To ensure further success, we encourage and recommend Nepal to consider expediting its work on the draft bill to make basic education compulsory and free. We also note the achievements in the areas of health-related MDGs and recommend these efforts be further accelerated, aiming at decreasing the infant, child and maternal mortality rates and increasing average life expectancy. We also encourage the international community to partner with the government of Nepal to provide all possible assistance on the request and in consultation with Nepal to realize its human rights objectives. Finally, we wish Nepal all success in its UPR engagement. I thank you.
Thank you. Next speaker is the distinguished delegate from Sweden.
President, Sweden wishes to welcome Minister Thapa and express our thanks for the information provided to address our advanced questions. Sweden recommends the government of Nepal, first, to take the necessary steps to ensure that the new constitution is implemented while protecting human rights and thus ensuring its provisions on gender equality, LGBT and minorities. Second, to make further efforts to ensure safety in prisons for both men and women, and to sign the optional protocol to the Convention Against Torture. We note the considerable progress made by Nepal since the last UPR. The announcement of a new democratic constitution, including provisions on gender equality, LGBT and minorities, was a historical achievement. At the same time, challenges remain. Since the last UPR, there have been reports about discrimination against Hindu minority population. The Madesi and Thoro minorities have claimed that they are not adequately represented in the new constitution. As a consequence, there has been unrest in several parts of the country, resulting in the loss of lives. Nepal commendably ratified the Convention Against Torture in 1991. A significant next step would be the ratification of its optional protocol. Ratification would mark an important signal to working preventatively. The UN Committee Against Torture stated in 2013 that systematic torture had occurred in Nepal's prisons. Concern about the safety of female prisoners has also been expressed. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you. I'd like to call upon the distinguished delegate from Switzerland to take the floor.
Monsieur le Président, la Suisse souhaite la bienvenue à la délégation du Népal, en particulier à son Excellence, Monsieur le Ministre, et la remercie pour la présentation de son deuxième rapport national. La Suisse se félicite des efforts entrepris par le Népal pour la protection des droits de l'homme. Cependant, la Suisse est préoccupée par l'usage excessif de la force par des forces de sécurité lors de la gestion des manifestations. La Suisse recommande au Népal de garantir le respect des principes de proportionnalité et de nécessité dans tout recours à la force, en conformité avec les principes de base des Nations Unies sur le recours à la force et l'utilisation des armes à feu. Nous restons préoccupés par l'incompatibilité de la Commission de vérité et de réconciliation et de la Commission de disparition avec les obligations internationales du Népal. La Suisse recommande au Népal d'exécuter le jugement de la Cour suprême du 26 février 2015 dans les meilleurs délais. Lors du premier cycle, la Suisse a recommandé au gouvernement du Népal d'éliminer la discrimination fondée sur la caste. Malgré la promulgation d'une loi à cet égard en 2011, des cas de discrimination restent répandus et peu enquêtés. La Suisse recommande au Népal de mettre en place une stratégie concrète pour la mise en œuvre intégrale de la loi sur la discrimination fondée sur la caste et l'intouchabilité de 2011. Ensuite, la Suisse recommande au Népal de ratifier le statut de Rome portant création de la Cour pénale internationale. Finalement, la Suisse recommande au Népal d'émettre une invitation permanente aux procédures spéciales du Conseil des droits de l'homme. Je vous remercie.
Thank you. At this point, I'd like to give the floor back to His Excellency Mr. Kamal Thapa and his delegation to answer questions that have been raised so far. You have the floor.
Thank you very much, Mr. President, for giving me the floor again. I also would like to thank all the members states who have spoken so far. This interactive dialogue is becoming lively and obviously encouraging to me and also to my delegation. I also would like to thank the member states for their kind words of sympathy and condolences on the loss of life and property after the massive earthquake that Nepal experienced on 25th April this year. The devastating earthquake caused a serious damage to the life and property. Almost 9,000 people are killed and almost 7 billion loss on economic terms has been estimated. This devastation has also caused an enormity of challenges to the overall transformation of our society. It has considerably constrained our ability to protect the rights of those affected by the devastation. However, the government is fully committed to addressing the challenges through timely recovery and reconstruction works. The assurances of support expressed by our neighbors and other friendly countries as well as the international organizations has been quite encouraging. I would like to take this opportunity to express our sincere thanks and appreciation to the international community for their generous support. Mr. President, I also would like to thank the member states who have expressed their support and encouragement on the promulgation of the new constitution. Drafting of the new constitution through Constituent Assembly in itself was a very difficult task, especially in a country like Nepal, having a diverse socio-cultural complexity. But despite that, we have been able to draft and promulgate the new constitution, which is truly a democratic and inclusive constitution. It has incorporated all the democratic values and norms of human rights. Now the challenges before us is the implementation of the Constitution. Let me be honest with you that some of the measures, some of the provisions that we have incorporated in the Constitution are at a level, at a quite an ambitious level. Implementation of those provisions are definitely a big challenge, but the commitment of the government and the commitment of the political parties, commitment of the civil society, and the overwhelming support of the Nepalese population is there. So, with that in background, I would like to assure this August gathering that we will be able to effectively implement the provisions of the Constitution. Article 47 of the Constitution has categorically mentioned that the government should formulate legislation within 3 years to effectively implement some of the right issues provided in the Constitution. We have already begun that process, and within the time stipulated in the Constitution, I am sure that we will be able to fulfill that mandatory provision. Mr. President, with this remark, I would like to request some of my colleagues to express their views on some of the issues that has been raised in this August session. I would like to request Secretary at the Prime Minister's Office, Mr. Kamal Salih Ghimire, to start with.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, first of all, we appreciate advanced question and recommendation from different country and delegates regarding the transitional justice. Transitional justice mechanism has already been established to ensure the justice and reconciliation in the society. The government believes that the mechanisms will fulfill its tasks in view of the nature of the conflict. International human rights standards, practices adopted in the other jurisdictions and the body of the Supreme Court of Nepal. Thank you.
Now, with your permission, to Mr. Dilliraj Ghimire, Joint Secretary, Ministry of Law, for his remarks.
Mr. President, with the permission of the head of delegation of Nepal, I would like to respond to some of the questions raised by the distinguished delegates vis-à-vis ratification of some treaties, standing invitation, right to education, particularly the issue of dropouts and the questions relating to refugees and asylum seekers. Mr. President, Nepal appreciates the recommendations made by the delegates for joining some treaties, including OPCAT. Being treaties an important source of international human rights law, Nepal has become a party to 162 and signatory to 26 multilateral treaties, including 22 human rights related treaties. State policies on political and governance system of our Constitution envisage to maintain the rule of law by protecting human rights and implementing treaties to which Nepal is a party. Obviously, effective implementation of treaties is as important as joining them. Nepal is in the process of developing necessary policy, legal and institutional infrastructure that are required to implement these treaties in its territory. In pursuance of the UPR Action Plan and National Human Rights Action Plan, the government has submitted a number of important bills, including bills on penal code, criminal procedure code, sentencing legislation, and prevention of torture to the legislature parliament for enactment. It is also drafting a legislation on prevention of enforced disappearances. On this occasion, I would like to mention that we are in the process of establishing requisite framework for joining these treaties as appropriate in due course of time. Mr. President, we appreciate the recommendation for extending invitation to the mandate holders. Various mandate holders have already visited Nepal on occasions, and visits of special procedures on independence of judges and lawyers and migrants have been agreed in principle. Nepal has received visit requests by some 10 mandate holders. Nepal recognizes and values the contribution that such mandate holders can make to development of human rights norms and protection of rights on the ground. With the promulgation of the new constitution, the government is engaged in the formulation of necessary laws and institutional frameworks as mentioned by Honorable Deputy Prime Minister for the implementation of the constitution. In this context, Nepal will consider the request for visit already made by such mandate holders as appropriate in due course of time. Mr. President, the Constitution in Article 24 prohibits untouchability in both public and private places and also outlaws discrimination at work place on basis of untouchability. Right of Dalit to participate in all state bodies on basis of principle of proportional inclusion is a fundamental right that is enforceable by law. It is the obligation of the state to make special provision for empowerment, participation and representation in public places, areas of employment, health, social security, housing and provision of land to landless Dalits within 3 years. The Dalit has also the fundamental right to free education up to higher education with scholarship. Moreover, the Caste-Based Discrimination and Untouchability Prevention Act 2011 is being implemented. Cases of discrimination against Dalit have been prosecuted under this law. Since 2011, according to the updated record, a total of 57 cases on untouchability against 294 perpetrators have already been prosecuted in the courts of law in Nepal, and 18 cases convicted and 12 acquitted. The government is focusing on capacity building of law enforcement authorities, awareness raising, Dalit access to justice, avoiding delay in investigation of cases, if any, and integrated action plan is also being prepared to curb de facto discrimination. Mr. President, in relation to right to education, particularly the issue of dropout and great reputation, I would like to mention that the right of access to basic education, right to compulsory and free basic education, and to free education up to secondary level has been guaranteed by the fundamental law of the land. The persons with disabilities has right to free education through Braille, script and in sign language. Now, the basic education is compulsory in Nepal by law, and the government has made a bill to amend the education-related law to implement these provisions. Mr. President, with the implementation of the school sector reform program, progress has been made in terms of net enrollment rate, literacy rate, trained teachers, and investment. And in order to address the issue of dropout, and we have also found that there is a gap in relation to dropout, and we have devised a number of measures to tackle this issue. And the specific measures to deal with issues include, in particular, avoiding the conflict of school schedule with agricultural schedule, increasing the number of female teachers, and there is a provision of one female teacher in each community school for hearing complaints and psychosocial counseling, and there is 38.2% increase in number of female teachers in primary level, 20.8% at lower secondary, and 30.9% in the secondary level. And there are also measures to improve teaching methodology, expanding school in the remote areas, improving facilities in schools. For example, now 81.3% of the schools have toilet facilities, and 67.6% schools have separate toilet facilities for female students. Measures to combat child marriage have also been taken, and we have also focused on the multilingual education, and now this sort of education is conducted in 7,500 schools. And this is our target to complete this by the end of this year. And we have prepared school books in mother tongues, and there are these books in currently 16 mother tongues, and we have started the training of trainers on the girls, parent education and awareness programs, and there are some programs on daily meal schemes. And for example, 194,000 students in the remote areas, 413,000 from Karnali and other districts, including students from Raute, Chepang, Badi, Musar communities. So these are some of the important measures we have taken to address the issue of dropout. And in relation to the issue of refugees and asylum seekers, Mr. President, Nepal is not a member of the Refugee Convention 1951, and it is not in a position to accept refugees because of its internal capacity and geopolitical situation. Despite these limitations, it had to accept a great number of refugees in the past. We do not have an issue of asylum seeker per se. However, there are some people from different countries who have violated visa regulations by overstayed or entering Nepal on fake passport or visa. Nepal has allowed them to return back to their home countries or third countries in good offices of UNHCR. The UN government of Nepal has waived visa fees and fines and pardoned sentences several times on humanitarian ground. We have maintained clear policy of not accepting refugees from any country. Thank you, Mr. President.
Mr. President, with your permission, I also would like to invite Mr. Ramesh Thakal, Joint Secretary, for his remarks.
Thank you. With the permission of our head of the delegations, I would like to respond some of the questions that has been raised here in this August sessions, particularly in regards to the provision of citizenship in the constitutions, strengthening national human rights institutions, torture and other relevant cases. In regards to the citizenship in new constitutions, the new constitution is more gender-friendly and progressive in comparison with previous constitutions, including the interim constitutions. Particularly, the new constitution follows the principles of equality and non-discrimination in regards to the providing citizenship right to Nepalese citizens. The constitution empowers women to transfer her citizenship to her child, and in this regard, we have recorded some of the whys in regards to the citizenship provision of new constitutions, and we would like to clear that the constitution has mandated the federal parliament to enact federal laws on citizenship to provide detailed provision on acquisition, requisitions and termination of citizenship, and the constitution has not fully addressed all the concerns, and which will be addressed in details by those laws to be adopted by the federal parliament in this regard. And in regards to the child born abroad to Nepali woman and foreign father, the child is entitled to get naturalized citizenship of Nepal if he or she has permanent domicile in Nepal and has not acquired citizenship of any foreign country. Likewise, if the father and mother of the child has acquired the citizenship of Nepal, in such condition, such child can acquire citizenship by descent as well. So, therefore, the Nepalese woman married to foreign men can transfer her citizenship by descent to her child. It has ensured the gender equality and non-discriminations in regards to the citizenship right. And the new constitution has ensured the rights of Nepalese citizens not to deny their citizenship right under any circumstances. In regards to the strengthening of national human rights institutions, the government is very committed to work together with the National Human Rights Commissions as well as other national human rights institutions to provide it with adequate funding and autonomy to ensure that the commissions can properly fulfill their mandate as provided in law and constitutions. And the National Human Rights Commissions Act that was adopted in 2012 has not limited the independence and the autonomy of National Human Rights Commissions, and in line with the new constitutions, the government is committed to revise the existing laws and to submit other necessary bills for the commissions that has been upgraded at constitutional body from statutory body and executive body. And equally, the government has given high priority for the implementations of the recommendations made by those human rights commissions and other human rights institutions. In regards to the torture is absolutely prohibited by the prevailing laws of Nepal under any circumstances and for any purpose. The government has adopted the policy of zero tolerance against torture and ill treatment of any forms. Because of preventive, punitive and promotional measures, the 3 Ps, the torture in the police is significantly declining. The recent data shows that the torture rate has been continuously reduced since the last 11 years. A research carried out by the Office of the Attorney General as shows denotes the 15% torture in the police custody, and it has been reduced by 2.5 every year since 2005. So we are on the right track to combat torture and ill treatment under any circumstances, and our target is to completely end the single cases of torture. And for this project, now we have given the high priority of at least 5 main areas. Firstly, the enactment of comprehensive bill that fully criminalizes all forms of torture, and that has been already submitted to the legislature parliament. Secondly, reform in criminal justice systems in order to introduce internationally accepted principles and best practice in our legal systems, and thirdly, capacity enhancement of law enforcement authorities by providing extensive training and sufficient technology and resources to make the investigations and prosecutions more evidence-based, and fourthly, strengthening our existing national preventive mechanisms. And with this, we have made significant progress for this purpose. In regards to the excessive use of force, we believe that the Nepalese law, particularly the Local Administration Act and other prevalent acts, are in line with the UN principles on the use of firearms and force, and that under that law, the security personnel can use the necessary force in order to maintain public law, order, and to save life and property of public in the last resort. And the government has strictly pursued the policy to use force in line with these principles and the directives made by our Supreme Court in this regard. In regards to the right to housing, the government is implementing a national housing policy based on the concept of housing for all, with the objective of providing government support to low-income groups and particularly ensuring planned human settlement. The 13th current plan aims to provide safe and affordable housing facilities, particularly for marginalized communities and people, and for this we have made some progress, and with the program that has been adopted by the government, that will be given continuity in the days ahead. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Dhakal. Mr. President, with your permission, since some of the delegates have raised issues regarding women empowerment, child labor, I would like to invite Radhika Aryal, Joint Secretary, for her remarks.
Thank you, Mr. President, Excellencies, Member States and observers. With a due permission from Honorable Head of the Delegates, I am responding the concerns that have been raised by Member States on gender equality, women's empowerment, child protection, disaggregated data on people living with disability, rights of marginalized people including LGBTI. The recently promulgated new Constitution of Nepal has envisioned the fundamental values of human rights, gender equality and women's empowerment. It has embodied the notion of substantive equality and non-discrimination as a fundamental rights of citizen. In line with the proportionate inclusive policy, affirmative actions have been introduced to ensure women's participation in all levels of state mechanism. It has also established women's equal right to property and all economic resources. There are sustained efforts to introduce laws and review and amend prevailing to strengthen gender equality for all the people regardless of their age, caste, sex, race, ethnicity, cultural or religious background, sexual orientation, health status, and people living with disabilities. Recently, Parliament has endorsed the Workplace Sexual Harassment Act and Witchcraft Allegation Act, and also amended 32 acts having gender discriminatory provisions. A draft bill to criminalize all kinds of traditional harmful social practices, including dowry, child marriage, discrimination and exclusion, is in offing. Nepal has made significant progress in the realization of women's and girls' human rights and for the promotion of gender equality and women's empowerment. National Women Missionaries, with its outreach all over the country, National Women Commission upgraded as a constitutional body, women representation as a head of the state, head of the parliament, and second position in the judiciary. Similarly, participation of women in civil service and other government sectors as well as security sectors have been increased significantly. In public service, participation of women is 17%, which was just 2.1% in the year 2001. This happened because of the introduction of affirmative actions and reservation systems. Government of Nepal is committed to effectively implementation of the gender-responsive affirmative policy for furthering women's equal access to and full participation in power and decision-making level. Similarly, women has gained access and ownership to the land and house. Gender parity has been achieved in primary and secondary level. In the last year secondary level examination, girls student outnumber the boys student. Gender responsive budgeting has been initiated in national budgeting. Around 22% of total budget is now allocated as a direct gender responsive budget, which is noted as the progress in the region. Regarding to the gender-based violence, the recently amended Domestic Violence Act has specifically spelled out the definition of physical, economic and mental violence. Government has established various funds like Gender-Based Violence Elevation Fund, Rehabilitation Fund and various service centers for providing prompt services to the victims and survivors of gender-based violence, human trafficking, for the immediate rescue, medical care, legal aid, psychosocial support, rehabilitation and reintegration. Similarly, 35 days statute of limitations has been extended to 90 days. In case of minor rape victims, the statute of limitation is commenced after she attains the age of 16 years. Regarding the child right and child protection, a draft bill on Children Act has various provisions to end all forms of violence against children, including child labor, child marriage, corporal punishment, child trafficking, child sexual abuse and exploitation. Right after the devastating earthquake on 25th April, government has taken important policy decision for controlling human trafficking, gender-based violence. Coordination mechanism has been set up in all mechanism and various checkpoints, women-friendly spaces, child-friendly spaces have been established and vigilance has increased, which sharply decreased the gender-based violence and trafficking cases than it was expected before. Thank you.
Mr. President, back to you.
Thank you. We continue in our speakers list. The next speaker on the list is the distinguished delegate from Thailand.
Mr. President, Thailand welcomes the delegation of Nepal to the second UPR cycle. We appreciate the progress made by the government of Nepal in poverty alleviation, housing programs, and improvement of social and economic rights. It remains important that the most disadvantaged and marginalized groups be prioritized in policies and strategies on access to resources and to ensure that they are not left behind, particularly with regard to the right to adequate food. In light of the tragic earthquake earlier this year, Thailand expresses its solidarity with the people of Nepal. We encourage the government of Nepal in its reconstruction effort to ensure non-discriminatory access to relief supplies and inclusive participation in decisions and reconstruction. Thailand remains concerned about numerous reports of caste-based violence and discrimination against women, especially indigenous women. We therefore recommend Nepal to strengthen its efforts to effectively implement existing laws and policies to eliminate all forms of discrimination. Thailand welcomes the adoption of the 2014 of the National Health Policy and the Health Insurance Directives. We recommend Nepal to improve access to affordable health care for all through the effective implementation of its policy and directives. I thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you. The next speaker is the distinguished delegate from Timor-Leste.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Timor-Leste would like to welcome the members of the delegation of the Federated Democratic Republic of Nepal and congratulate for their participation in the 23rd session of UPR Working Group. Timor-Leste would like to congratulate Nepal for electing the first woman as a president in its political history. Timor-Leste acknowledges Nepal's commitment to improve the human rights situation in the country, and we note with appreciation of policies and programs promote gender equality, such as the National Strategic for Action Plan and Gender Empowerment and elimination of gender-based violence. We acknowledge the effort made by the government of Nepal. Nevertheless, Timor-Leste would like to take this opportunity to make the following recommendations. First, Nepal ratifies ICRMW. Second, encourages Nepal to continue to advocate for the principle of equality between men and women in decision-making. Finally, Nepal to finalize the revision of the Child Act in order to set up coordination mechanism related to case of child victims trafficking. I thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you. The next speaker is the distinguished delegate from Uganda.
Mr. President, Uganda welcomes the delegation of Nepal led by the Honorable Prime Minister and Minister of Foreign Affairs, and we commend the government for its continued engagement with the UPR process, despite the many challenges being faced. Uganda recognizes that as a country emerging from conflict and the impact of a major devastating earthquake, the priority of the government is to address the transitional needs of the country for quick recovery before contributing to achieving long-term goals. However, we note that a strong and effective national human rights institution is essential for proper administration of justice. We therefore recommend to the government to enact relevant legislation to provide for necessary autonomy and independence of the National Human Rights Commission in accordance with the decision of the Supreme Court of Nepal. We also note that Nepal has already developed a national action plan as a basis for implementing the 2011 UPR recommendations. However, the process was reported as not widely consultative and not inclusive of all stakeholders. We would appreciate to know how the government intends to address this implementation gap. Finally, Mr. President, we recommend that the government puts in place an effective mechanism for addressing the reported multiple forms of discrimination against indigenous women in Nepal. I thank you.
Thank you. The next speaker is the distinguished delegate from Ukraine.
Thank you, Mr. President. Ukraine welcomes the delegation of Nepal and thanks for presentation of the national report prepared with their civil society. We commend the steps taken so far towards the adoption of the new constitution, which should speed up ongoing and long-term economic and social development of the country, as well as reconstruction efforts, including implementation of the reforms enabling people to better enjoy human rights. Being aware of the difficult situation Nepal is facing following the devastating earthquakes earlier this year and a number of significant human rights challenges in this regard, Ukraine would like to recommend to ensure an inclusive dialogue with all Nepalese minority groups, to further promote cooperation with the HRC special procedures, including facilitating the visits of the mandate holders to the country. Recognizing crucial importance of prevention of human rights violations, we would also like to encourage the government of Nepal to consider ratifying the optional protocol to the Convention Against Torture, as well as other international human rights documents. I thank you.
Thank you. The next speaker is the distinguished delegate from United Arab Emirates.
سيد الرئيس، يسعدني أن أرحب باسم وفد الإمارات العربية المتحدة بمعالي كمال تابة نائب رئيس مجلس الوزراء ووزير الخارجية والوفد المرافق له، كما أود أن أشكره على العرض القيم الذي تقدم به في مستهل هذه الجلسة. السيد الرئيس، نشيد بالخطوات الهامة التي اتخذتها النيبال في مجال المرأة والطفل، ومنها زيادة الميزانية المخصصة لتعزيز المساواة بين الجنسين وتمكين المرأة إلى 21%، بالإضافة إلى زيادة فرص امتلاك الأراضي للمرأة. كما نشيد بالحرص المتواصل الذي توليه حكومة النيبال لقطاع التعليم من خلال وضع مشروع قانون يجعل التعليم الأساسي إلزاميا ومجانيا، بالإضافة إلى تعميم هذه المجانية إلى التعليم الثانوي. ويعتبر هذا المشروع في رأينا تقدما هاما في مجال حقوق الإنسان الأساسية واستثمارا ثمينا في عنصر الطاقات البشرية بصفته الركيزة الأساسية التي تعتمد عليها الأمم. أود أن أبقى في مجال التعليم لأتقدم بتوصية وسؤال إلى وفد النيبال المحترم. التوصية: مواصلة تنفيذ خطة العمل الوطنية لتوفير التعليم للجميع تشمل الفئات الاجتماعية الضعيفة اقتصاديا. السؤال: هل يمكن إفادتنا بما وصل إليه تنفيذ خطة إصلاح قطاع المدارس التي وضعتها الحكومة خلال الفترة 2009-2016؟ وشكرا السيد الرئيس.
Thank you. Next speaker is the distinguished delegate from the UK.
Thank you, Mr. President. The UK welcomes Nepal to the UPR. The adoption of the new constitution marks a milestone. We were pleased to see the adoption of 31 rights, including on rights of women and Dalits, and look forward to seeing these implemented. However, we have concerns about discrimination against women in the citizenship provisions. We note with concern the violence following the adoption of the constitution and urge the government to ensure independent investigations. We note some progress on the UK's previous recommendations, including on transitional justice mechanisms. However, serious concerns remain about amnesty provisions and time limits that could inhibit the filing of complaints. No legislation has been adopted to criminalise torture, and the draft bill is not in line with international standards. We recognise steps taken to address violence and discrimination against women and girls, but encourage further implementation of the national action plans and increased action to reduce the high numbers of child, early and forced marriages. We recommend, first, remove or at least extend the 35-day statute of limitations for reporting rape cases. Second, strengthen the rule of law by establishing an independent complaints commission capable of investigating and prosecuting complaints against the security forces. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you. Next speaker is the distinguished delegate from the United States of America.
Thank you, Mr. President. The United States welcomes the delegation of Nepal. We commend Nepal for establishing 2 transitional justice mechanisms to account for conflict-era human rights abuses and finalizing a constitution enshrining the principle of non-discrimination for members of various groups. We thank Nepal for hosting vulnerable refugees and for supporting third-country resettlement for Bhutanese refugees. We encourage robust implementation of Nepal's new policy limiting recruitment fees to help ensure migrant workers are not charged fees that make them more vulnerable to exploitation abroad. We are concerned about discriminatory access to earthquake relief, particularly among Dalits and members of other marginalized groups, and about provisions in the Constitution that appear to restrict proselytizing and voluntary religious conversion, as well as provisions on citizenship that may discriminate against women and increase the risk of statelessness. We are also concerned that over 20 years have passed since the last registration of Tibetan refugees, leaving the majority of the population undocumented, without the right to work and ability to travel. Bearing in mind these concerns, we recommend that Nepal, 1, ensure that earthquake relief engages and addresses the needs of members of vulnerable communities, including Dalits, and promotes decent work. 2, consider amending the Constitution to strike provisions that appear to curtail religious freedoms and to allow women to convey their citizenship to their children and foreign spouses on an equal basis with men. And 3, register refugees and provide documentation so they are able to work, access education, and travel. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you. The next speaker is the distinguished delegate from Uruguay.
Gracias, señor presidente. Uruguay da la bienvenida a la delegación de Nepal y saluda los distintos avances que se han verificado desde la finalización del conflicto armado en 2006, incluyendo la aprobación de una nueva constitución de carácter inclusivo. Destacamos logros como la reducción de la pobreza en los últimos años y alentamos a Nepal a continuar los esfuerzos en materia de promoción y protección de los derechos humanos. Observamos que Nepal ha ratificado un importante número de instrumentos internacionales de derechos humanos y en línea con este compromiso demostrado, deseamos recomendar ratificar el protocolo facultativo del Pacto de Derechos Económicos, Sociales y Culturales, ratificar el protocolo facultativo de la Convención contra la Tortura y adherirse al Estatuto de Roma de la Corte Penal Internacional y a la Convención sobre la imprescriptibilidad de los crímenes de guerra y de lesa humanidad. Preocupa que denuncias de crímenes cometidos durante el conflicto, como por ejemplo tortura, desapariciones forzadas y ejecuciones extrajudiciales, todavía están esperando por verdad, justicia y reparación. En este sentido, recomendamos se realizan los esfuerzos necesarios a fin de investigar los crímenes de derecho internacional o violaciones de derechos humanos que han tenido lugar, protegiendo a las víctimas de esas violaciones y garantizándoles el acceso a la justicia y a reparaciones plenas y efectivas. Recomendamos extender una invitación abierta a los procedimientos especiales y aceptar las solicitudes de visita realizadas por algunos de ellos, incluyendo la solicitud de visita del relator especial sobre verdad, justicia, reparación y garantías de no repetición. Muchas gracias.
Thank you. I'd like to call upon the distinguished delegate from Venezuela to take the floor.
Presidente, damos la bienvenida a la ilustre delegación de Nepal encabezada por su excelencia Kamal Taapa y agradecemos su presentación. Encomiamos su participación en el EPO. Valoramos los esfuerzos del gobierno en el cumplimiento de las recomendaciones aceptadas. A pesar de las tragedias pasadas, el país se ha mantenido firme en el empeño de construir un futuro mejor para su pueblo. Aplaudimos que se impulsen programas de salud, vivienda y alimentación para los más necesitados y que, según el censo de 2011, se haya disminuido la pobreza de 21 a 15% en las zonas urbanas y de 43 al 27% en las zonas rurales. La Comunidad de Naciones y las agencias internacionales deben brindar toda la cooperación que Nepal requiera para lograr sus objetivos de justicia social. Recomendamos a Nepal seguir avanzando en la protección de los derechos de la mujer, consolidando los mecanismos institucionales creados, continuar fortaleciendo las acertadas políticas sociales para el acceso a la educación y la salud de su pueblo, en particular de sus mujeres y niños, seguir reforzando los acertados programas de creación de empleo y asistencia a los más vulnerables en la lucha contra la pobreza y la desigualdad social. Le auguramos éxito en su examen.
Thank you. Next speaker is the distinguished delegate from Vietnam. Seems to be absent. In this case, we move on. Next speaker is distinguished delegate from Yemen. Present.
شكرا سيد الرئيس. نرحب بمعالي السيد كمال تبا نائب رئيس الوزراء وزير الخارجية رئيس وفد النيبال الموقر ومرافقيه، ونعبر عن التقدير للعرض المفصل والقيم الذي قدمه واستعرض فيه الجهود التي بذلتها حكومة النيبال الموقرة في مجال حقوق الإنسان. ورغم التحديات والصعوبات التي تواجهها حكومة النيبال إلا أنها اتخذت تدابير تشريعية في مجال إدراج التزاماتها بموجب اتفاقيات حقوق الإنسان في قوانينها الوطنية وتنفيذها، كما اتخذت عددا من الإجراءات لتحسين المستوى المعيشي للمواطنين في إطار برنامجها الوطني لمكافحة الفقر وتحقيق التنمية والمساواة بين المواطنين. إن وفد بلادي يثمن الاهتمام الذي تبديه حكومة النيبال في مجال حقوق الإنسان ويوصيها بالاستمرار في مواصلة جهودها في تبني سياسة تنموية تلبي احتياجات الشعب وتحسن المستوى المعيشي للمواطنين من أجل حماية وتعزيز حقوق الإنسان، ويتمنى لها مزيدا من التقدم والازدهار. وشكرا.
Thank you. The next speaker is distinguished delegate from Afghanistan.
Thank you, Mr. President. Afghanistan extends a warm welcome to the distinguished delegation of Nepal to the 23rd session of the UPR Working Group. And thanks the esteemed delegation for the informative and comprehensive presentation of its national report. We appreciate Nepal's continuous positive engagement in the UPR process. Afghanistan highly values the strong commitment of the government of Nepal in strengthening the institutional structure for the promotion and protection of the human rights through the establishment of the national human rights institutions. We likewise note with a great enthusiasm all the positive improvements since its first UPR cycle, which includes the establishment of transitional justice mechanism, improvement in the security system, and the criminal justice system. We appreciate the measures taken by the government of Nepal to gradually provide secondary education for free and primary education as compulsory. We hope progress in this regard will be sustained and strengthened. Therefore, we wish to recommend Nepal to accelerate the process of considering the bill currently under consideration at the Ministry of Education of Nepal. Finally, Afghanistan would like to offer its best wishes to the government and the people of Nepal in their future endeavors toward the promotion and protection of human rights in the country. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you. The next speaker is the distinguished delegate from Algeria.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Nous souhaitons une chaleureuse bienvenue à la délégation du Népal, que nous remercions pour son excellente présentation. Malgré les difficultés et les effets dévastateurs laissés par le terrible séisme qui a frappé le Népal le 25 avril 2015, le gouvernement népalais a pris des mesures adéquates et s'est engagé à améliorer les conditions de vie et de jouissance des droits de l'homme par tous les citoyens. Nous prenons bonne note de la progression sur la voie de l'élaboration d'une nouvelle constitution au Népal, qui va permettre l'exercice de l'ensemble des libertés et des droits fondamentaux, notamment la liberté de la religion et le droit à l'égalité pour tous, conformément aux normes internationales en vigueur. Ma délégation encourage les mesures prises par le Népal pour prémunir les travailleurs migrants du risque d'exploitation et pour faire face à ce problème. Ma délégation souhaite très respectueusement présenter à son homologue du Népal les 2 recommandations suivantes. 1. Promulguer le projet de loi relatif au harcèlement sexuel sur les lieux de travail. 2. Ratifier la convention numéro 87 de l'Organisation internationale du travail. Enfin, et pour conclure, ma délégation souhaite que le Népal puisse bénéficier de l'assistance technique nécessaire, lui permettant de mieux s'acquitter de ses obligations relatives aux droits de l'homme et de promouvoir les droits de ses citoyens. Je vous remercie, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you. I'd like to call upon the distinguished delegate from Argentina to take the floor.
Muchas gracias, señor presidente. La delegación argentina desea dar la bienvenida a la delegación de Nepal y agradecer la presentación de su informe nacional. Argentina desea felicitar a Nepal por el establecimiento de la Comisión de la Verdad y la Reconciliación y la Comisión de Investigación de Desapariciones Forzadas. Con relación a ello, y dado que nuestro país está impulsando una campaña internacional tendiente a la ratificación de la Convención Internacional para la Protección de todas las personas contra las desapariciones forzadas, deseamos recomendar a las autoridades de Nepal que ratifiquen dicha convención. Por otra parte, teniendo en cuenta la preocupación manifestada por varios órganos de tratados respecto de la discriminación de facto contra la comunidad Dalit, vemos con satisfacción la adopción de la ley sobre la discriminación en razón de la casta y la intocabilidad y recomendamos a Nepal la investigación de los actos de discriminación contra la comunidad Dalit. Muchas gracias, señor presidente.
Thank you. Next speaker is the distinguished delegate from Australia.
Thank you, Mr. President. Australia appreciates the engagement of the Nepalese delegation to the Universal Periodic Review process. Australia welcomes progress made by the government of Nepal in finalising its constitution and acknowledges the difficult process to reconcile the various demands of a large number of ethnic groups and interests. Australia urges all parties to find a resolution to achieve peace and stability for Nepal. We offer our sincere condolences to the people of Nepal for the loss of life in the April and May earthquakes. Australia recommends Nepal develop a redress mechanism to address all forms of discrimination and human rights violations in post-earthquake reconstruction efforts. With a large number of Nepalese working abroad, Australia recommends Nepal to collaborate with civil society, regional and global organisations to protect the rights of migrant workers. We welcome the formation of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission and the Commission to investigate enforced disappearances and encourage Nepal to conduct these bodies in line with original commitments to comply with international standards. Australia recommends that Nepal ensures the effective functioning of the National Human Rights Commission of Nepal, including a representative approach to appointments. Finally, we welcome Nepal's commitment to end gender-based violence. Australia recommends Nepal develop a national action plan to end gender-based violence and to bring rape laws in line with international standards. I thank you.
Thank you. Next speaker is distinguished delegate from Bangladesh.
Thank you, Mr. President. My delegation cordially welcomes the delegation of Nepal. Bangladesh appreciates the continuation of democratic transition process in the country in line with our recommendation made in its first EPR. The recently held election in Nepal has come at a crucial juncture in Nepal's history. We are confident that the country will move towards peace, stability and development by accommodating the aspiration of all the Nepalese people. As fellow SAARC and LDC member, we fully acknowledge the challenges faced by Nepal in its efforts to ensure full enjoyment of all human rights in the country. Despite considerable achievements made, poverty remains a serious impediment for the enjoyment of human rights of the Nepalese people. In addition to this, the country suffers from natural disasters and impact of climate change that threaten the enjoyment of human rights. The recent earthquake in Nepal caused widespread destruction and loss of life. It has caused around 9,000 deaths and almost 100,000 displaced people. Many people affected by the disaster are highly vulnerable owing to socio-economic and geographic factors. Considering these impediments, we need to keep in mind that it is not possible for Nepal to progress without continuous and coordinated efforts well supported by the international community in line with the country's needs, national programs and policies. We therefore recommend the government of Nepal to continue its fight against poverty with the support and cooperation of the international community. We assure Bangladesh's continued commitment in extending cooperation to Nepal in its efforts. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you. The next speaker is the distinguished delegate from Belgium.
Monsieur le Président, la Belgique salue les efforts du Népal en vue de renforcer son bilan en matière de droits de l'homme et se réfère dans ce contexte à l'adoption de la nouvelle constitution du Népal adoptée en septembre 2015. La Belgique souhaite formuler les 3 recommandations suivantes dans les domaines de lutte contre l'impunité, de lutte contre la violence contre les femmes et de droits de l'enfant. Premièrement, mettre la loi de 2014 relative à la commission d'enquête sur les personnes disparues, la vérité et la réconciliation en conformité avec les normes internationales, en particulier en ce qui concerne la définition de l'amnistie, la protection des témoins et les délais de plainte. Ensuite, mettre les lois relatives au viol en conformité avec les normes internationales, en particulier en ce qui concerne la définition légale du viol et le délai pour déposer plainte. Enfin, intensifier les mesures de lutte contre la violence faite aux enfants, en particulier en matière de prévention des mariages d'enfants précoces et forcés et de la traite des enfants, en particulier au moyen des campagnes de sensibilisation auprès des familles. Pour conclure, ma délégation aimerait poser la question suivante. Le gouvernement envisage-t-il l'adhésion au statut de Rome de la Cour pénale internationale? Je vous remercie, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you. The next speaker is the distinguished delegate from Bhutan.
Mr. President, my delegation extends a warm welcome to the high-level delegation of Nepal. As Himalayan neighbors, Bhutan and Nepal share many important characteristics with similar aspirations and challenges. As a country that lies in the seismic zone with frequent earthquakes, Bhutan can empathize the suffering and the damage the devastating earthquake of April 2015 has inflicted upon the people of Nepal. While Bhutan was able to play a small part in the relief efforts, we commend the excellent job the government of Nepal has done in responding to the disaster and for ensuring a high-quality relief, rehabilitation and reconstruction in the post-earthquake context. We would also like to laud the Nepalese government for their efforts in bringing about gender equality in politics and work life, which is evident from the increased representation of women in parliament. And the recent election of the first woman president and the first woman speaker is a big achievement. Mr. President, as Nepal approaches its crucial stage of political transformation process with the adoption of its constitution in September 2015, we hope that the rationale will prevail and all the issues will be resolved to the satisfaction of all parties concerned. As it paves the way for reconstruction and overcome the political roadblocks for peace and stability, our best wishes are with the people and the government of Nepal, and we call upon the international community to render continued support and goodwill. In conclusion, we recommend Nepal to seek enhanced international support for economic development and reconstruction of infrastructure destroyed due to the conflict and devastating earthquakes. I thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you. I'd like to call upon the distinguished delegate from Bolivia to take the floor. Bolivia seems to be absent. In this case, we move on to Botswana. You have the floor.
Mr. President, Botswana welcomes the delegation of Nepal to the second UPR. We thank them for the presentation of their national report. We note with appreciation Nepal's ratification of core international human rights instruments, the establishment of transitional justice mechanisms, and the adoption of the new constitution that seeks to ensure the enjoyment of fundamental human rights and freedoms. In addition, the implementation of the climate change policy and the national framework of local adaptation plan for action will go a long way in addressing impacts of climate change on human rights. However, we note reports by treaty bodies regarding discrimination against women, trafficking of women and girls for sexual exploitation and forced labor, among others. We are also concerned about reports of physical attacks, death threats, harassment, and reprisals of human rights defenders by security forces, armed groups, and youth wings of political parties. We note the challenges faced in addressing some of the human rights concerns, including establishment of effective institutions, transitional justice systems, and accountability mechanisms to deal with crimes of the past. We encourage Nepal to continue its cooperation with human rights mechanisms to ensure progress in these areas. We recommend that Nepal step up efforts to eliminate gender equity and implement the national strategy on ending child marriages. 2. Investigate all cases of threats and attacks against human rights defenders. We wish Nepal a successful review and adoption of the UPR report. I thank you.
Thank you. Next speaker is the distinguished delegate from Brazil.
Thank you, Mr. President. Brazil takes note with appreciation of the adoption of the 4th National Human Rights Action Plan by Nepal. We also highlight the implementation of the 13th five-year plan by Nepal, which includes measures aiming at the promotion of a non-discriminatory and inclusive society. We encourage the adoption of policies to eliminate all forms of discrimination, including against Dalits, women, Tarots, Madesi, indigenous peoples, and religious minorities. We welcome the implementation of a national strategy, an action plan on gender empowerment and gender-based violence, in line with recommendations made by Brazil in the first cycle. However, discriminatory practices and violence against women remain a concern. We take note with satisfaction of measures to safeguard the right to food, such as the school feeding program, as also recommended by Brazil. Brazil wishes to recommend that Nepal, number 1, take measures to enforce legislation prohibiting child labor and to facilitate access to education for all children, particularly the poor and disadvantaged. And number 2, take measures to implement the Supreme Court's decision concerning same-sex marriage. While welcoming the national plan on the elimination of child labor, we express concern about the high number of children, particularly girls, who are at work. Prevalent early and forced marriage is also an important challenge. Nepal has made important progress on realizing the human rights of LGBT persons, including Supreme Court decisions on citizenship, IDs, and same-sex marriage. However, LGBT people still face marginalization and discrimination. Thank you.
Thank you. I'd like to call upon the distinguished delegate from Canada to take the floor.
Thank you, Mr. President. Canada welcomes the report and participation of the delegation of Nepal. Canada recommends that Nepal, 1, take necessary measures to ensure the guarantee in Nepal's constitution of full equality between men and women with respect to the nationality of their children, and in accordance with Article 9.2 of the CEDAW, which Nepal has ratified. 2, ensure the independence and impartiality of the judicial system, in particular through efforts to guarantee that the Judicial Council operates without interference from the executive branch of government. 3, ensure that law enforcement thoroughly investigates all claims of domestic violence and that perpetrators are prosecuted. 4, take steps to ensure that the Truth and Reconciliation Commission and the Commission on Disappearances function in accordance with international standards and bring the perpetrators of serious human rights violations to justice. Canada welcomes the progress on democratic reforms since Nepal's first UPR and congratulates Nepal on the promulgation of its new constitution. In particular, Canada would like to commend Nepal's efforts towards ensuring equality of LGBT persons. Canada recognizes Nepal's significant efforts to reform its legal framework. We strongly encourage Nepal to consolidate implementation of these measures, including through the engagement of all stakeholders. Canada reiterates its condolences regarding the devastating earthquake and aftershocks. We encourage Nepal to ensure that its
time is up. We have to move on. Next speaker is Chile. You have the floor.
Gracias, señor presidente. Saludamos a la delegación de Nepal, encabezada por su viceprimer ministro, y agradecemos la presentación de su informe nacional. Valoramos los avances realizados en la promoción y protección de derechos humanos en un contexto complejo, producto del devastador terremoto que asoló al país en abril pasado. En este sentido, deseamos destacar la promulgación de un nuevo texto constitucional que busca reflejar y proteger la diversidad cultural y étnica de Nepal. Nos permitimos formular las siguientes recomendaciones. 1. Elevar la edad de responsabilidad penal de los niños que hoy son imputables penalmente a partir de los 10 años de edad. Segundo, en relación con lo anterior, recomendamos la implementación de centros especiales de detención e internación para niños y niñas con el fin de evitar su criminalización ulterior y favorecer su reinserción. Y finalmente, recomendamos ratificar el protocolo facultativo de la Convención sobre los Derechos del Niño relativo al procedimiento de comunicaciones. Muchas gracias.
Thank you. The next speaker is the distinguished delegate from China.
主席先生，中国代表团欢迎尼泊尔代表团出席此次会议，赞赏尼泊尔建设性参与国别人权审查进程。中方赞赏尼泊尔努力落实第一轮国别人权审查中接受的建议，人权事业不断进步。注意到尼泊尔议会妇女议员人数大大增加，尼泊尔政府加强劳动保护和社会保障，注重通过定期发展计划执行减贫政策，推进社会和经济公平，并对赤贫者、妇女、残疾人、土著人、低种姓人群等弱势和边缘群体予以特别关注。尼泊尔作为世界上最不发达国家之一，在实现可持续发展方面面临较多挑战。中方呼吁国际社会以联大发展峰会通过2030年可持续发展议程为契机，加大对尼泊尔的人道和发展援助力度，协助尼泊尔促进和保障人民发展权、经社文权利等各项人权。中方愿向尼泊尔提出2项建议：一是继续将减贫作为国家发展计划的优先事项，提高弱势群体生活水平；二是继续加大教育投入，提高教育覆盖率和教育质量，特别关注贫困学生、女童、残疾儿童等弱势群体的教育权。
Thank you.
谢谢。
I'm very sorry. The next speaker is the distinguished delegate from Colombia.
Gracias, señor presidente. Colombia agradece a Nepal por la completa información en relación con la situación de derechos humanos en su país y destaca su compromiso por adelantar las recomendaciones recibidas durante el primer ciclo del EPU. En particular, reconocemos la determinación del gobierno de Nepal para combatir el trabajo forzado en condiciones de servidumbre. Asimismo, acogemos con satisfacción la entrada en vigor en 2011 de la ley sobre el sistema de castas y la intocabilidad. En el espíritu de cooperación que caracteriza el EPU, Colombia se permite hacer las siguientes recomendaciones a Nepal. Primero, avanzar en la implementación integral de la nueva Constitución en concordancia con la protección de los derechos humanos. 2. Continuar con los avances en la implementación de medidas para procurar el socorro y la rehabilitación necesarias a las personas desplazadas por desastres naturales. Colombia pone a disposición de Nepal su experiencia en estos campos. Muchas gracias.
Thank you. I'd like to call upon the distinguished delegate from Costa Rica to take the floor.
Gracias, señor presidente. La delegación de Costa Rica saluda a la delegación de Nepal y agradece la presentación de su informe nacional. Aprovechamos esta oportunidad para expresar nuestras más sinceras condolencias con el pueblo nepalí por el terremoto sufrido en abril pasado, el cual tuvo consecuencias humanitarias inconmensurables. Nos congratulamos por las recomendaciones implementadas desde el último examen, especialmente aquellas que fortalecen la institucionalidad, como el establecimiento de mecanismos de justicia de transición y la importante mejora del sistema de seguridad. Hemos podido constatar un aumento en la representación de las mujeres en puestos de decisión a nivel político. Los felicitamos por su Programa Nacional de Adaptación al Cambio Climático. A mi país preocupa la situación de las minorías en Nepal y la impunidad persistente con respecto a los sucesos acaecidos durante la guerra civil. Creemos que existe una urgente necesidad de abordar las violaciones de derechos humanos, incluyendo abusos contra grupos minoritarios étnicos y abusos contra los refugiados del Tíbet. Hacemos eco de la preocupación del Comité de Derechos Humanos sobre represalias contra periodistas y defensores de derechos humanos por parte de las fuerzas de seguridad. Recomendamos ratificar e implementar la legislación nacional, el Estatuto de Roma de la Corte Penal Internacional, tomar medidas para asegurar la participación de las mujeres en el proceso de paz, incluyendo en comisiones de la verdad. Tercero, formular una invitación abierta para que los procedimientos especiales puedan visitar el país. Muchas gracias.
Thank you. Next speaker is the distinguished delegate from Cuba.
Gracias, señor presidente. Damos la bienvenida a la distinguida delegación de Nepal y agradecemos la presentación de su informe nacional. Destacamos los cambios positivos introducidos en el marco normativo y estructural del país tras el primer ciclo del EPO, como la mejora del sistema de seguridad y del funcionamiento del sistema de justicia penal, el fortalecimiento de las estructuras institucionales de protección y promoción de los derechos humanos, entre otros avances en la materia. También se destaca la aplicación de la Estrategia Nacional y Plan de Acción sobre el Empoderamiento de Género y la Eliminación de la Violencia de Género 2013-2018 y del Plan de Acción Nacional para la Infancia 2005-2015, los cuales redundarán en una mejor protección de los derechos de las mujeres y los niños. Señor Presidente, respetuosamente recomendamos a Nepal, primero, aplicar en sus planes periódicos de desarrollo una política de mitigación de la pobreza encaminada a la justicia social y económica. Segundo, implementar en todo su contenido el cuarto Plan Nacional de Acción en Derechos Humanos de carácter quinquenal 2014-2019 para fomentar la adhesión colectiva a los derechos humanos. Instamos a la comunidad internacional a apoyar a Nepal para poder seguir adelante con sus políticas de desarrollo y de derechos humanos, en especial luego del terremoto del 25 de abril de 2015. Muchas gracias.
Thank you. The next speaker is the distinguished delegate from Cyprus.
Mr. President, Cyprus welcomes Nepal's participation in the second cycle of the UPR and commends its authorities for the comprehensive national report submitted, as well as for the presentation before us today. Cyprus wishes to commend the measures that the government of Nepal has taken to implement its international human rights obligations. In particular, we welcome the initiatives undertaken for the promotion of women's rights, such as the adoption of the national strategy and action plan on gender empowerment and elimination of gender-based violence 2013-2018. Cyprus has the following two recommendations. One, ensure that freedom of assembly is guaranteed and lift all restrictions on peaceful protest. And two, take all necessary measures towards acceding to the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you. The next speaker is the distinguished delegate from the Czech Republic.
Thank you, Mr. President. Czech Republic warmly welcomes the delegation of Nepal and we thank for its presentation. We offer the following recommendation. We recommend that Nepal implement the Supreme Court rulings of 2013 and 2015 on the True Reconciliation and Disappearance Act, so that investigation into human rights violation committed during the civil war, compensation for victims and reconciliation efforts are undertaken in accordance with international standard on transitional justice. Second, we recommend the government adopt effective measures for the protection of assistance to victims of gender-based violence and ensure that all cases of gender-based violence are duly investigated and perpetrators prosecuted. Third, we recommend Nepal to assess the implementation and effectiveness of laws aimed at ending or preventing all forms of discrimination, in particular against women and Dalits, and take the concrete step to translate anti-discrimination efforts into effective practice on the ground. We further recommend that Nepal accede to OP-CAT and the Rome Statute of the ICC. And finally, we recommend issuing a standing invitation to special procedures of the Human Rights Council. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you. I'd like to call upon the distinguished delegate from the Netherlands to take the floor.
Thank you, Mr. President. The Netherlands thanks the Republic of Nepal for its report, and together with others in the room today, once more express our deepest commiserations with the victims of the April 2015 earthquake and their families. We commend Nepal for steps taken to finalize the new constitution. The Netherlands would like to make the following recommendations to the government of Nepal. 1. To take measures to guarantee that all outstanding allegations of crimes are investigated and to ensure that perpetrators of human rights violations are brought to justice in proceedings which meet with international standards. And 2. To ensure that police provide a safe and confidential environment for women and girls to report incidents of violence, including sexual violence and incidents of trafficking, and that all complaints are recorded and effectively investigated. We make these recommendations because we are concerned by the persisting climate of impunity And the Commission on Investigation of Disappeared Persons, Truth and Reconciliation Act 2014 is of particular concern and should be brought in line with international law. Furthermore, women face discrimination and violence in public and private life, and domestic violence remains an issue. Trafficking of women and children remains a problem, especially in the post-earthquake situation and in districts that are bordering India. We take this opportunity to call on the Nepalese authorities to continue the ongoing dialogue with India with a view to fully restoring cross-border traffic, as the recent fuel shortages have seriously hampered
I'm very
the
sorry,
vulnerable
time is up.
Nepalese.
We have to move on. The next speaker is distinguished delegate from Djibouti.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Je vous remercie pour la présentation du rapport national. Djibouti salue les efforts entrepris par le Népal pour promouvoir une culture de droits de l'homme, notamment en adoptant et en mettant en œuvre un plan quinquennal en faveur des droits de l'homme et suite aux recommandations de l'examen périodique universel. Nous saluons également les projets relatifs à l'élaboration d'une nouvelle constitution garantissant l'ensemble des libertés et des droits fondamentaux, notamment le droit à l'égalité pour tous. Djibouti souhaiterait formuler les recommandations suivantes. 1. Nous vous encourageons à renforcer et à protéger les droits des enfants, notamment en éliminant le travail des enfants et en facilitant l'accès des enfants pauvres à l'éducation. 2. Former les agents de la force publique aux principes des droits de l'homme, notamment à la prévention des tortures et du mauvais traitement. Enfin, nous vous souhaitons plein succès pour la mise en œuvre effective des recommandations issues de ces dialogues interactifs. Et je vous remercie, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you. Next speaker is distinguished delegate from Egypt.
The delegation welcomes the representatives of the government of Nepal. Since the last review, Nepal, in the context of the National Human Rights Action Plan and the National Follow-up Mechanism on UPR, continued to take steps towards further promotion of human rights. Egypt welcomes the establishment of transitional justice mechanisms, the enhanced political representation of women, addressing the risk of exploitation of migrant workers, and extending consolidated social protection measures, particularly for the poorest and most disadvantaged. We are also encouraged by the progress achieved in relation to reducing maternal and child mortality, promoting children and women's rights, and poverty eradication. We are of the view that development partners need to continue to robustly support the efforts of Nepal, being a least developed country that suffered from years of brutal conflict and devastating natural disasters, most recently in the earthquakes of April and May of this year. Moreover, my delegation seeks the views of the delegation of Nepal on the expected positive contribution of the new constitution once adopted on human rights protection and promotion in the country. In conclusion, Egypt recommends the following for the kind consideration of the government of Nepal. 1. To consider ratifying the International Convention on the Rights of Migrant Workers and their Families and the Palermo Protocol. 2. To maintain its resolve to eliminate harmful practices against women and children and to consider adopting a national legislation on combating sexual harassment. 3. To provide protection to the family as the natural and fundamental unit of the society. I thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you. I'd like to call upon the distinguished delegate from Estonia to take the floor.
Thank you, Mr. President. Estonia warmly welcomes the delegation of Nepal to the UPR session. We congratulate the government of Nepal for the adoption of Nepal's new constitution. Further on, we call all parties to discuss the outstanding concerns of Nepalese citizens in an atmosphere of dialogue and compromise. Estonia shares the concern of the Human Rights Committee that journalists and human rights defenders were subjected to physical attacks, threats, harassment and reprisals by security forces, police, armed groups and youth wings of political parties. We are also concerned that despite some steps taken, the issue of violence against women and children, including sexual violence and abuse, is a burning problem. Women and girls, particularly those of Dalit origin, still suffer from harmful traditional practices. Estonia would like to make the following recommendations. First, to establish a special mechanism responsible for independent child rights monitoring. Second, to ensure the right to freedom of expression online, offline, in law and in practice, including by decriminalizing defamation, and to investigate all cases of threats and attacks against journalists and human rights defenders. And 3, to ratify the Rome Statute of the ICC and incorporate its provisions into national legislation, and to accede to the agreement on privileges and immunities of the court. We wish the delegation of Nepal a successful review meeting. I thank you.
Thank you. Next speaker is distinguished delegate from Finland.
Thank you, Mr. President. Finland welcomes the Nepalese delegation and would like to thank Nepal for presenting its national report. Finland congratulates Nepal for its new constitution, which is an important achievement that supports and advances democratic governance in Nepal. Finland makes the following recommendations. Firstly, Finland recommends that Nepal ensures equal educational opportunities for all children, including girls and Dalit children, in line with the observations made by the Committee on the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women and the Committee on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights. Secondly, Finland recommends Nepal to ensure the freed bonded laborers access to fertile land and their equal enjoyment of human rights, including the right to work and right to property, in line with the observations made by the Committee on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights. In addition to the recommendations made, Finland welcomes the Nepalese constitution's provisions providing for compulsory and free primary education, women's equal inheritance rights, including the right to property, as well as the rehabilitation of bonded laborers. This rehabilitation includes arrangement of housing and providing employment and arable land for their livelihoods. We are delighted to note that the enrollment and literacy rates have steadily increased, but remain concerned about the disparity in the quality of education among schools and groups of children. Finland stresses the importance of implementing these provisions in practice in accordance with Nepal's international human rights obligations. Thank you.
Thank you. Je donne la parole au distingué délégué de la France.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Je voudrais tout d'abord saluer Monsieur le Vice-Premier ministre Kamal Tapa, ainsi que la délégation népalaise, et le remercier pour la présentation du rapport national. La France salue l'adoption de la nouvelle constitution par l'Assemblée constituante du Népal, ainsi que la nomination de la Commission nationale des droits de l'homme. La France souhaite faire les recommandations suivantes au Népal. Premièrement, ratifier la Convention internationale pour la protection de toutes les personnes contre les disparitions forcées. Deuxièmement, mettre fin à l'impunité des forces de l'ordre. Troisièmement, assurer la protection des réfugiés tibétains en ratifiant et en appliquant la Convention de 1951 relative au statut des réfugiés et son protocole de 1967. Enfin, lutter contre les violences faites aux femmes et garantir l'égalité des droits. Je vous remercie, Monsieur le Président.
C'est moi qui vous remercie. The next speaker is a distinguished delegate from Germany.
Thank you, Mr. President. Germany congratulates Nepal for the adoption of the new constitution. In addition, Germany thanks all civil society organizations for their extraordinary efforts in Nepal's peace-building process. Germany encourages Nepal's path to reconciliation. Germany offers the following recommendations to Nepal. Ratify the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court, provide refugees and their families with identification certificates, making sure that all children of refugees have access to education, and repeal restrictions on refugees' rights to own property, to work, to establish and incorporate a business, and to travel freely. Strictly uphold and respect the international law prohibiting refoulement. Ratify the optional protocol to the Convention Against Torture, and introduce legislation providing appropriate criminal penalties for acts of torture. Establish independent procedures to ensure that all allegations of torture are investigated promptly, thoroughly, impartially, and independently, that any officials responsible for torture are held accountable, and that any victims of torture have the right to remedy and reparations. Work actively to abolish legal and factual discrimination based on ethnicity, gender, and caste, inter alia, by developing effective and independent mechanisms for the implementation of the Caste-Based Discrimination and Untouchability Act. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you. Next speaker is distinguished delegate from Ghana.
Thank you, Mr. President. Ghana welcomes the distinguished delegation of Nepal and commends them for their commitment to the UPR mechanism. My delegation is gratified to know that Nepal has demonstrated strong commitment to upholding and ratifying core international human rights instruments. We also know that Nepal has taken steps to improve some normative and structural human rights framework and implemented recommendations made by member states of this Council during their first UPR cycle, including, among other things, significant improvement in the security system, the establishment of transitional justice mechanisms, and improvement in the functioning of the criminal justice system. We, however, recommend that Nepal continues cooperation with the UN system and ratifies the following treaties: the Rome Statute of the ICC, the ICPPED, and the optional protocol of the CAT. We wish Nepal every success with their UPR. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you. Next speaker is the distinguished delegate from Haiti.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. La délégation haïtienne accueille chaleureusement la délégation du Népal dans le cadre de son passage à l'examen périodique universel. Elle souhaite faire des recommandations sur le même sujet. Elle recommande 1. Dépénalisation de l'acte de suicide. 2. Mettre l'accent sur la prévention du suicide et l'assistance à ces personnes et à leurs familles en prenant en compte du désespoir inspiré par sa geste. Ma délégation souhaite tout le meilleur pour Népal et ses efforts pour reconstruire. Je vous remercie, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you. Next speaker is the distinguished delegate from Hungary.
Mr. President, we welcome the delegation of Nepal and we congratulate Ms. Bandari on her election as the first female president of the country. We wish her every success, endurance and strength in her duties. Hungary also welcomes the adoption of the new constitution in September 2015. We wish to raise the following 3 points. Hungary commends that Nepal has ratified a number of human rights treaties. Although laws, policies and plans are in place, the level of implementation remains weak, with place for improvement. We recommend the ratification of the Rome Statute of the ICC and its implementation in national legislation. We believe that full cooperation with international human rights mechanisms is of key importance for the effective implementation of international human rights standards at national level. Therefore, Hungary recommends the government of Nepal to accept the request of visit by the Special Rapporteur on the promotion of truth, justice, reparation and guarantees of non-recurrence, the Special Rapporteur on human rights defenders, the UN Working Group on enforced or involuntary disappearances, and cooperate fully with the mandate holders. Finally, with regard to the promises of reform and the recommendation accepted during its previous UPR in 2011, we wish to hear about the plans of the government regarding the modification of its citizenship laws, not to leave an estimated 4 million people without official status and at a risk of statelessness. We recommend Nepal amending these laws to allow citizenship through either parent. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you. Next speaker is the distinguished delegate from India.
Thank you, Mr. President. India welcomes the delegation of Nepal led by His Excellency Mr. Kamal Thapa, Deputy Prime Minister and Minister of Foreign Affairs. Mr. President, the people of Nepal, having endured a devastating earthquake in April 2015, are facing another tough challenge during the ongoing political transition. Violence and instability in parts of Nepal has worsened in the run-up to and after the adoption of the Nepal's constitution in September 2015. Over 45 persons died, mostly civilians, and hundreds injured. Firings which had ceased just after the adoption of the constitutions have reoccurred. We are concerned over the lack of political progress. We note the concerns expressed by the UN human rights bodies, UN country team, and Nepal's own Human Rights Commission over continuing incidents of violence, extrajudicial killings, and ethnic discrimination in the country. We urge the government of Nepal to investigate and take credible measures to prevent their recurrence. Problems facing Nepal are political in nature and cannot be resolved through force or a security-based approach. As a close and friendly neighbor, India has consistently appealed to the government of Nepal to address all challenges in a spirit of dialogue and reconciliation. We recommend the government of Nepal to consolidate the constitution building and democratization process by accommodating all sections of Nepal to enable broad-based ownership and participation. Ensure effective functioning of Truth and Reconciliation Commission and full implementation of its recommendations, including prosecution of those responsible for violent insurgency. Ensure the independence and financial autonomy of the National Human Rights Commission and set up an independent commission for children and women. Mr. President, obstruction referred in the Honorable Leader of Delegation statement is on Nepalese side caused by the Nepalese protesters. India, with deep-rooted historic and cultural ties, will continue to extend all...
The time is up. And the next speaker is the distinguished delegate from Indonesia.
Thank you, Mr. President. My delegation would like to welcome the delegation of Nepal and thanks them for the national report. Indonesia commends the efforts by the government of Nepal in advancing the promotion and protection of human rights including with regard to our previous recommendation on comprehensive legislation and enforcement in the areas of domestic violence and human trafficking. Indonesia also notes with appreciation the commitment of government of Nepal on the continued implementation of its fourth generation of National Human Rights Action Plan. Indonesia notes a number of measures taken by the government of Nepal to prevent and manage the risk of exploitation of migrant workers. In this connection, we recommend the government of Nepal to continue its consideration to ratify the ICMW. We appreciate that the efforts of the government of Nepal to gradually provide secondary education for free and make primary education compulsory. We therefore recommend the government of Nepal to continue its efforts to improve access to education for all, including by providing adequate resources. Finally, we wish the government and people of Nepal all the best in their endeavors to further promote and protect human rights in the country. I thank you.
Thank you. The next speaker is distinguished delegate from Ireland.
Thank you, Mr. President. Ireland welcomes the delegation of Nepal and thanks it for its presentation today. Ireland commends the positive efforts undertaken by Nepal since its first UPR, despite difficult circumstances, including the devastating earthquake earlier this year. We extend our sympathy to the families of the thousands of people killed. We welcome the adoption in February 2011 of the National Action Plan on Women, Peace and Security. We encourage Nepal to further pursue its commitment to address the impact of the armed conflict and recognize the survivors of sexual violence that occurred during the conflict as conflict victims in all support programs, including the Interim Relief Program. Ireland is concerned that reports that journalists, media workers and human rights offenders are victims of physical and sexual violence, detention, harassment, intimidation and stigmatization by security forces. Ireland recommends that Nepal create and maintain, in law and practice, a safe and enabling environment in which journalists, media workers, human rights offenders and civil society can operate free from hindrance and insecurity in accordance with Human Rights Council resolutions 22.6, 27.5 and 27.31. Ireland is concerned at reports on the lack of enjoyment of the right to adequate food and nutrition in Nepal, including famine amongst vulnerable groups, soaring food prices ahead of winter, and child malnutrition. While we recognize the difficulties faced, Ireland recommends that Nepal adopt a comprehensive national strategy to ensure food and nutrition security for all, in line with international standards. Thank you.
Thank you. Next speaker is distinguished delegate from Israel.
Thank you, Mr. President. We warmly welcome the delegation of Nepal and thank them for the report, which is the result of extensive consultations, including different sectors of the government, the national human rights institutions, and NGOs. Israel congratulates Nepal for the development of periodic national human rights action plans, including the current one under development, as well as for the notable increase of the representation of women in parliament to date. Israel commends the Senior Citizen Act, the National Strategy and Action Plan on Gender Empowerment, as well as the continued application of the National Policy and Plan of Action on Disability, and the introduction of a building code to make public buildings accessible for people with disabilities, and the progress on implementing inclusive education policy. Additionally, Israel would like to recommend to Nepal the following. First, to accelerate the discussion regarding the bill to make basic education compulsory and free, currently under consideration. Second, to continue taking action to reduce maternal and infant mortality. Third, to speed up the process to promote more participation of women in public offices. Fourth, to strengthen the protection of LGBTI people and works toward the full implementation of the current laws. Israel wishes Nepal a successful UPR. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you. Next speaker is distinguished delegate from Japan.
Thank you, Mr. President. Japan warmly welcomes the delegation of Nepal to this session. Japan commends the government of Nepal on its efforts to promote and protect human rights through the promulgation of Nepal's new constitution in September this year, which, in addition to providing extensive coverage of fundamental human rights, incorporates articles on protection of the human rights of indigenous and other minorities, Dalit, women, children, and socially vulnerable groups. On the other hand, considering the actual situation and the many issues that remain to be addressed, Japan recommends that Nepal make increased efforts to truly bring an end to discrimination. In regard to the human trafficking of women and children, Japan commends Nepal on the legal measures it has introduced and on the national and district committees it has established to address the situation. However, we note with concern reports that this issue has again come to the fore since the devastating earthquake that struck Nepal on the 25th of April this year. Taking this into account, Japan recommends that Nepal make increased efforts to introduce and effectively carry out new measures to deal with the problem. Finally, Japan recommends that Nepal ratifies the International Convention for the Protection of All Persons from Enforced Disappearance. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Next speaker is distinguished representative from the Lao People's Democratic Republic.
The Lao delegation warmly welcomes the distinguished delegation of Nepal, led by His Excellency Mr. Komo Tapas, Deputy Prime Minister and Minister of Foreign Affairs, and would like to thank for the comprehensive presentation of National Report on Human Rights Situation in the country.